The first promise of fatherhood is protection. It is the most sacred, unspoken contract a parent makes with a child. But when a marriage shatters, when the battlefield is a custody dispute, that sacred ground, a child's safety, is often the first casualty. The unwritten rule is simple. The children remain untouched, innocent bystanders to the war between adults. But what happens when the monster isn't lurking in the shadows? For the children in these cases, the threat came from inside the home. It came from the very men sworn to protect them, the men who chased away nightmares, who held the back of a bicycle seat, who whispered promises of forever. In the eyes of these fathers, their own children transformed. They ceased to be sons and daughters and became instruments of vengeance, the ultimate weapon, engineered to inflict a wound that would never heal. This wasn't a momentary snap, or the product of a mind lost to madness. This was something far colder, calculated revenge. Murders architected with a singular, chilling purpose to utterly shatter the psyche of the women who dared to leave them. They weaponized their own flesh and blood, committing the final, unforgivable act to guarantee a lifetime of suffering for their former partners. For this, the justice system would ensure they were erased from the world. In this investigation, we examine the cases of 20 fathers who chose filicide as the ultimate act of spite. The stories that follow will challenge the very notion of unconditional parental love, revealing its darkest, most twisted inversion. This is what happens when love curdles into hate and becomes the most cruel weapon of all. Case 1. John Battaglia. The date was May 2nd, 2001. In Dallas, Texas, Mary Jean Pearl brought her 2 young daughters to a designated drop-off point in Highland Park Village. It was for a scheduled dinner with their father, a visit that should have been utterly routine. 9-year-old Faith was known for her quick wit and humor. Her 6-year-old sister, Liberty, had dreams of dancing ballet. Both were students at John S. Bradfield Elementary. At approximately 5:30 in the evening, their father collected them and drove them to his loft apartment in the city's Deep Ellum district. Mary Jean went to a friend's home nearby, operating under the simple assumption that her daughters would be returned before their bedtime. Before the sun had fully set on Dallas, both girls would be dead, and their mother would be forced to listen to their final moments over a telephone line. The father was John David Battaglia Jr., a 45-year-old certified public accountant. His background included a degree from Fairleigh Dickinson University and service in the United States Marines. His marriage to Mary Jean began on April 6, 1991. To the outside world, they presented the image of a successful family, comfortably settled in the affluent Highland Park community. But behind the facade was a history of violence. Years earlier, in 1988, Battaglia had attacked his first wife, Michelle Getty, leaving her with a broken nose and a dislocated jaw. For that attack in 1987, he pleaded guilty to misdemeanor assault and was sentenced to 2 years of probation. At the time of her marriage, Mary Jean was unaware of the true depths of his violent nature. It was a truth she would discover firsthand. Their union lasted for nearly a decade marked by escalating verbal abuse from John. The couple finally separated in January of 1999. The violence reached a crisis point on Christmas of 1999. In front of his own daughters, Battaglia assaulted Mary Jean. Once again, he pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor and received another 2 years of probation. A protective order was put in place, one which explicitly forbade him from possessing firearms. The divorce became final in August of 2000. Mary Jean believed the worst was over, but in the spring of 2001, a hostile voicemail left by Battaglia constituted a clear violation of his probation. She did what she was supposed to do. She reported it. The authorities, in turn, issued a warrant for his arrest. On May 2, 2001, the day he would murder his daughters, John Battaglia found out about that warrant. That afternoon, he placed a call to his first ex-wife, Michelle Getty. The message he left was cryptic and deeply unsettling. He suggested that maybe Mary Jean should lose her children. At the time, no one grasped the terrifying implication. That same evening, inside his apartment at the Adam Hatz Lofts, with Faith and Liberty present, Battaglia dialed Mary Jean's number. He put their daughter, Faith, on the speakerphone. The little girl then asked her mother a question engineered by her father that would echo in Mary Jean's mind for eternity. "Mommy," she asked, "why do you want Daddy to go to jail?" And then came the sound of a gunshot. Mary Jean screamed into the receiver, "Run! Run for the door!" She frantically dialed 911. John Battaglia had shot his 9-year-old daughter, Faith, 3 times. The final shot was a contact wound to the back of her head. Her body was later discovered lying next to the kitchen telephone. He then turned the gun on 6-year-old Liberty, shooting her 4 times. According to the medical examiner's testimony, one of the wounds severed Liberty's spinal cord. It's believed she was conscious and paralyzed before the final, fatal shot to her head, unaware as her life slipped away. Investigators found her body just 10 to 15 feet from the front door. She had been trying to obey her mother's last command. After slaughtering his children, Battaglia left one final, sickening message on an answering machine for them. "Good night, my little babies. I hope you are resting in a different place." Then, as if nothing had happened, he went to a bar to meet his girlfriend. His night wasn't over. From the bar, he proceeded to a tattoo parlor, where he had 2 large, red roses permanently inked onto his bicep, one for each of the daughters he had just executed. At approximately 1 a.m. on May 3rd, police located Battaglia's truck parked outside that tattoo parlor. It took 4 officers to subdue and arrest him. A subsequent search of his apartment and vehicle uncovered an arsenal, 16 firearms in total, including the semi-automatic pistol used to end the lives of Faith and Liberty. The capital murder trial commenced on April 22, 2002, at the Frank Crowley Courts Building in Dallas. Lead prosecutor Howard Blackman took the floor to present the state's case. Defense attorneys Paul Johnson and Paul Bray attempted to construct a defense, but the evidence was insurmountable. The jury required only 19 minutes of deliberation to convict John Battaglia of capital murder. 19 minutes. That was all the time 12 people needed to decide this man should pay with his life. On April 30th, 2002, John Battaglia was formally sentenced to death. In court, Mary Jean Pearl confronted him head-on. "You are one of the most heinous murderers of modern times," she stated. "Burn in hell forever." John Battaglia would spend the subsequent 16 years on death row. The state granted stays of execution in March and December of 2016, but on February 1st, 2018, inside the Huntsville unit in Texas, John Battaglia was executed by lethal injection. He was declared dead at 9:40 in the evening. His final words were a bizarre and remorseless spectacle. "No." "Well, hi, Mary Jean. See you later. Bye. Go ahead, please." He then reportedly asked, "Am I still alive?" and left. There was no apology, no sign of regret. Mary Jean Pearl witnessed the execution from the viewing gallery. Speaking to reporters afterward, she said simply, "I've seen enough of him." The case would become a catalyst for legislative change. Texas Senate Bill 140, signed into law on September 1st, 2001, now mandates that judges must take any history of domestic violence into account when ruling on custody matters. Faith and Liberty's Place, a supervised visitation center in Dallas run by the Family Place, was founded in their memory. Author Irene Pence chronicled the case in her 2003 book, No Daddy Don't. In the space of a single phone call, Mary Jean Pearl lost both her daughters, the result of a man's decision that if he could no longer control her, he would utterly shatter her world. Faith was 9 years old. Liberty was 6. They were simply children, excited to see their father. They ran to the door to greet him when he arrived, and he murdered them as an act of calculated cruelty against their mother. John Battaglia executed his own daughters and then spent his final moments on earth laughing. Case 2. Ronald Shanabarger. On the evening of June 19, 1999, the night before Father's Day, Ronald Lee Shanabarger stretched plastic food wrap over the face of his 7-month-old son, Tyler. He then left the room to eat a sandwich. He returned 20 minutes later, took off the plastic, rolled the infant face down in his crib, and went to sleep. The next morning, Tyler's mother discovered him, his body blue and rigid with rigor mortis. What was initially ruled a case of SIDS would soon be exposed as something far more malevolent. The murder was the climax of a 3-year plot for revenge, a plan conceived before Tyler was even a thought. Ronald Lee Shanabarger was a 30-year-old man working at a tire retreading center in Franklin, Indiana. He had been in a long-term relationship with his girlfriend, Amy Parsons. In October of 1996, Ronald's father passed away. Amy was on a cruise at the time of the death. Ronald pleaded with her to end her trip and return home. She refused. That refusal planted a dark seed in Ronald's psyche, one that would grow into one of the most meticulously planned murders in Indiana's history. Ronald decided that Amy had to be made to feel the same anguish he felt at the loss of his father, but it wasn't enough for her to lose just anyone she loved. He needed her to lose someone with whom she had forged the deepest possible bond, someone whose absence would leave her utterly devastated. And so, he architected a plan. He would propose to Amy. They would get married and start a family. He would wait patiently as she bonded with their new child. Then, he would murder that child. They were wed in May of 1997. Tyler was born on November 26, 1998. Ronald also secured a $100,000 life insurance policy on the baby. For 7 months, Ronald waited. He watched Amy fall completely in love with their son. He watched as she fed him, bathed him, sang to him, and held him while he slept. And through it all, Ronald was methodically planning the moment he would tear that child away from her. On the night of June 19, 1999, Amy was working a late shift as a cashier at a grocery store. Ronald was home with Tyler, alone. He took the cellophane food wrap and sealed it over the baby's face. Tyler was 7 months old. He could not defend himself. He could not comprehend what was happening. Ronald left the nursery and fixed himself a sandwich. He sat and ate his meal while his son slowly suffocated in the other room. 20 minutes later, he went back, unwrapped the plastic, and laid Tyler face down in his crib. Then, Ronald Schannebarger went to bed. The next morning, on Father's Day, Amy arrived home from her shift and went to look in on Tyler. She found him face down, blue and cold. Rigor mortis had already taken hold. She screamed for help. A volunteer chaplain, Reverend Randy Maynard, arrived with the first responders. He would later testify that Ronald was cold, detached, and made no effort to comfort his hysterically grieving wife. The death was preliminarily ruled as sudden infant death syndrome. But 3 days later, on June 22nd, Ronald confessed to Amy. He laid out the entire story: the plan, the patient waiting, the murder, the revenge. The following morning, Amy drove him to the Johnson County Sheriff's Office, where he confessed again to detectives. He was formally charged on June 24, 1999. Throughout the investigation and subsequent trial, prosecutors would catalog 9 separate confessions. Ronald confessed to Amy. He confessed to detectives twice. He confessed to the chaplain. He confessed to his sister, Bonita, and his brother-in-law, Larry Savage. He confessed in numerous letters he wrote from jail. According to Police Chief Harry Farah, Ronald's confession was unwavering. The plan to murder his son, Tyler, had been in place since before the child was even conceived. The boy's entire life was simply an instrument of a long simmering plot for revenge. In late April of 2002, a 9-day jury trial commenced at the Johnson Superior Court. The case was presided over by Special Judge Raymond D. Kickbush. Leading the state's case was Johnson County Prosecutor Lance Hamner. Defense attorneys Jay Hoffman and Jennifer Orga faced an insurmountable task, attempting to build a defense against the weight of their own client's devastating confessions. The physical evidence was damning. Cellophane wrap discovered in the yard bearing a DNA match and the $100,000 life insurance policy Ronald had secured on an infant. On May 8, 2002, the jury returned its verdict. Ronald Schannebarger was guilty of murder. On June 13, 2002, Judge Kickbush delivered the sentence: 49 years in prison. Not life without the possibility of parole, but a finite term of 49 years. Facing the real possibility of his eventual release, Amy could only say through tears, "Happy Father's Day." Her father, Robert Parsons, was more direct, declaring, "Donald, you'll burn in hell for this." Ronald Schannebarger is currently an inmate within the Indiana Department of Correction. His earliest eligibility for release was scheduled for approximately March of 2025, though public records remain ambiguous as to whether he has been paroled. Appeals were attempted in 2003 and 2006. Both were denied. Amy, of course, divorced Ronald. In her son's memory, she established the Tyler Memorial Fountain and Pond, located at Independence Park in Franklin. It was dedicated in 2003. The insurance policy was never paid. Tyler was 7 months old when his father ended his life. He never took his first step. He never spoke his first word. He never saw his first birthday. His entire brief existence was wielded as a weapon, a tool his father used to inflict pain on his mother. Ronald Schannebarger allowed 3 years to pass as he meticulously executed his revenge. He entered into a marriage with a woman he did not love. He brought a child into the world that he fully intended to kill. He held his own baby. He fed him. He put him to sleep. And then he suffocated him with plastic wrap and ate a sandwich while his own son died in the other room. Before we proceed to the next file, if you find this investigative work compelling, we encourage you to subscribe. Your support allows us to continue examining the cases that most other outlets refuse to touch. While Ronald Shanabar spent 3 years plotting a single murder, our next subject killed 3 children in a single afternoon with a knife. Case 3. Aaron Schaffhausen. On a Tuesday, July 10, 2012, an unplanned visit from their father was a source of excitement for 3 young sisters at their home on Morningside Avenue in River Falls, Wisconsin. Amara was 11, a budding scientist who watched MIT lectures for fun and studied algebra. Sophie, at 8 years old, was a young artist who loved fashion and being outdoors. Cecilia, just 5, was fascinated by bugs and climbing, and was due to start kindergarten that autumn. All 3 girls ran to the door the moment their father arrived. In less than 2 hours, all 3 of them would be discovered dead in their beds, their throats slit, with white t-shirts tied around their necks. Aaron Schaffhausen was a 34-year-old construction foreman. He had married Jessica Lee Stowe on May 27, 2000, in Springfield. In 2006, they relocated to River Falls. For years, they projected the image of a normal family, with 3 beautiful daughters and a house in a quiet neighborhood. But the marriage was quietly disintegrating. Jessica filed for divorce on August 26, 2011. The process was finalized in January of 2012. The finality of the separation sent Aaron into a spiral of rage. He refused to accept it was over, sometimes calling Jessica up to 30 times in a single day. In March of 2012, he made a phone call with a message that should have led to his immediate detention. He told Jessica he wanted to drive to her home, bind her, and force her to choose which of their children he would kill. Then, he said, he would make her watch. Jessica reported the threat to the police. They classified the event as a harassment incident. No arrest followed. No protective order was issued. Aaron Schaffhausen remained free. Less than 2 weeks before the murders, Jessica began dating another man, Matthew Peterson. For Aaron, this was the final trigger. On July 5, 2012, he was terminated from his construction job with a St. Paul firm. 5 days later, he decided to take action. At around 11:45 on the morning of July 10th, Aaron sent a text to Jessica, asking to visit their daughters. Jessica consented. A babysitter was at the home at the time. At approximately 1:25 in the afternoon, Aaron arrived. The babysitter left at 1:40. The girls were now alone with their father. Sometime between 1:40 and 3:30 that afternoon, Aaron Schaffhausen cut the throats of all 3 of his daughters. 11-year-old Amara was killed in her bed. 8-year-old Sophie was killed in her bed. 5-year-old Cecilia was killed in her bed. For Cecilia, he had also strangled her, as if to make certain she was dead. After murdering the children, he tucked them into their beds and tied a white t-shirt around each of their necks. He also poured gasoline throughout the basement, though the fire was never set. He would later face a charge of attempted arson for this act. At approximately 3:30 that afternoon, Aaron called Jessica. She was at her office in St. Paul. He spoke 5 words that would completely destroy her life. "You can return home now. I've taken care of the children." Jessica would remain on the line with law enforcement for 40 minutes, driving from St. Paul to River Falls. For the entirety of that drive, she harbored the horrifying certainty that her daughters were gone. First responders breached the home to a scene of unimaginable stillness. All 3 girls were discovered in their own beds, their throats cut, yet they were tucked in as if merely asleep. The murder weapon, a knife, was later recovered. Aaron's DNA was on its handle. The blood of his daughters stained his clothing. There was no ambiguity about what had transpired in that house. On March 29, 2013, Aaron Schaffhausen entered a plea. Guilty, but with a claim of insanity. A 12-day trial to determine his mental state commenced at the St. Croix County Circuit Court, presided over by Judge Howard W. Cameron. The state's case was presented by Gary Freiberg from the Attorney General's office, alongside District Attorney Eric Johnson. John Kaczynski, the defense attorney, built his case on the argument that at the moment of the killings, Aaron was not legally sane and therefore could not bear full culpability. It took the jury just 3.5 hours of deliberation to reach a conclusion. They determined Aaron Schaffhausen was sane. He was fully aware of his actions when he murdered Amara, Sophie, and Cecilia. He understood the profound wrongness of his deeds, and he committed them anyway. On July 15, 2013, Judge Cameron handed down 3 consecutive life sentences, stripping away any possibility of parole. Cameron addressed the courtroom, stating, "Each child must be acknowledged as a distinct individual. The most difficult fact for me to process was that the girls ran to him, filled with joy. They rushed to the door, ecstatic to see their father, and he, in turn, murdered them." Aaron Schaffhausen is currently an inmate at the Waupun Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. In 2015, he attempted to appeal his conviction. The 3rd District Court of Appeals flatly denied his request. He is destined to die behind bars. Jessica found a way to move forward, marrying Matthew Peterson in 2013. Together, they brought 2 more children into the world. In October of 2022, Jessica released a memoir titled Thistles and Thorns, detailing the excruciating journey of surviving her daughter's loss and the painstaking process of rebuilding a life. In 2015, a new structure rose in Hoffman Park in River Falls, the Tri-Angels Playground, made possible after the community raised over $550,000 to build it. 3 angels, 3 sisters, 3 little girls who greeted their father with elation and were slaughtered because he sought to inflict the ultimate punishment on their mother. Amara was 11 years old. Sophie was 8, Cecilia was just 5. All of them were thrilled to see their dad. He cut their throats and then put them to bed. While Aaron Schaffhausen extinguished his daughter's lives in the seclusion of their home, the next father we examined chose a different stage. A public execution of his own child in front of hundreds of commuters during rush hour on one of Australia's most trafficked bridges. Case 4. Arthur Freeman. On a Thursday, January 29, 2009, at roughly 9:15 in the morning, Arthur Philip Freeman brought his Toyota Land Cruiser to a halt on the Westgate Bridge in Melbourne, Australia. It was the peak of the morning commute. The city was gripped by a record-shattering heat wave, and the temperature had already climbed to 42 degrees Celsius. The bridge was a slow-moving river of vehicles heading into the city. Arthur exited his vehicle, circled to the passenger side, opened the door, and lifted out his 4-year-old daughter, Darcy. Multiple eyewitnesses reported hearing her desperate cry. "Daddy, no!" she screamed as he carried her toward the guardrail. And then, Arthur Freeman hurled Darcy Iris Freeman 58 meters, nearly 190 feet into the Yarra River below. It was meant to be Darcy's very first day of primary school. Arthur Philip Freeman, approximately 36 or 37 years old, had a career in IT and finance. His residence was in Geelong, Victoria. He was married to a woman named Peta Barnes, and they had 3 children. Ben, the oldest, was 6 years old. Darcy was 4, and Jack was 2. To an outsider, they were the picture of a normal family. But Peta was living a different reality. Arthur was a man defined by control, jealousy, and a capacity for violence. She had confided in her doctor that she was terrified Arthur might one day hurt the children. Eventually, Peta left him and initiated divorce proceedings. The family court was drawn in to settle custody arrangements. On January 28, 2009, the day before the murder, the court issued its final orders. Peta was awarded a significant increase in custody time. Arthur's access to his children was consequently diminished. He was incandescent with rage. The following morning, January 29th, Peta was at Darcy's new school, waiting to celebrate her daughter's first day. Darcy was scheduled to be dropped off by Arthur, who was with the children for a court-ordered visit, but Darcy never showed up. Instead, Peta's phone rang. It was Arthur, and his message was cold. "Say goodbye to your children." He followed with a chilling promise. "You will never see your children again." Arthur then drove onto the Westgate Bridge, with all 3 of his children secured inside the car. Ben and Jack were in the back. Darcy was in the front passenger seat. He brought the vehicle to a complete stop on the bridge. He got out. He moved to Darcy's side of the car, pulled open the door, and lifted her into his arms. She was only 4 years old, yet she sensed that something was terribly wrong. Her scream echoed across the bridge. "Daddy, no!" Other drivers, witnessing the scene unfold, stopped their own cars. Some of them got out, shouting at Arthur, pleading with him to stop. But he proceeded to the railing and threw his daughter over the edge. She plunged 58 meters into the water. Emergency crews managed to pull her from the river and had her airlifted to the Royal Children's Hospital. There, Doctors fought to save her life, but the internal damage from the impact was too catastrophic. Darcy Iris Freeman was pronounced dead at 1:35 in the afternoon, with her mother right beside her. From the back seat of the car, Ben and Jack had seen it all. They were forced to watch their father commit an unthinkable act of violence against their own sister. The trial that followed was convened at the Supreme Court of Victoria from March 2nd through March 28th, 2011. Justice Paul Coughlin presided over the proceedings, while prosecutor Gavin Silbert, senior counsel, laid out the case for the state. On the opposing side, defense counsel David Brustman, senior counsel, mounted the argument for Arthur Freeman. 6 different psychiatrists were called to examine Freeman's mental state. An overwhelming majority, 5 of the 6, arrived at the same chilling conclusion. He was not suffering from mental impairment when he ended Darcy's life. He knew precisely what he was doing. He understood the profound wrongness of his actions. His motive was to inflict the ultimate punishment on Peta. The jury was composed of 5 men and 7 women. For 5 days, they remained locked in deliberation. At several junctures, it seemed the proceedings might collapse into a mistrial as the jury struggled to reach a consensus. But late on the evening of March 28, 2011, they delivered a unanimous verdict, guilty of murder. On April 11, 2011, Justice Coughlin delivered his sentence, life in prison for Arthur Freeman, with a non-parole period of 32 years. In response, Freeman launched into a bizarre tirade about Satan and government conspiracies, forcing his forcible removal from the courtroom. He filed an appeal against the conviction in May of 2011, but the appeal was denied. Arthur Freeman is currently an inmate at Barwon Prison in Geelong. He will not become eligible for parole until approximately January 29, 2041. If he survives that long, he will be in his late 60s or early 70s. In the aftermath of Darcy's death, permanent anti-suicide barriers were finally erected on the Westgate Bridge. These barriers measure 2.1 meters high. Since they were installed, the number of suicides from the bridge has plummeted by 85%. Peta Barnes filed a lawsuit against Vic Roads, arguing they failed to install these life-saving barriers sooner. She ultimately won her case. The tragedy was documented in a 2016 episode of the Australian television series Crimes That Shook Australia, and was also featured in Megan Norris's book, Look What You Made Me Do. Peta Barnes had only just dropped Darcy off for a visit mandated by the court. She was at the school, waiting to celebrate Darcy's first day of primary education. But instead of her daughter, she received a phone call, a voice telling her to say goodbye to her children. Moments later, she was watching in horror as doctors desperately tried to save her daughter's life after Arthur had thrown her from a bridge in front of hundreds of commuters during rush hour traffic. Darcy was 4 years old. It should have been the first day of her new school. Her last words were a scream. "Daddy, no." Then he let her go. Before we proceed to the next file, please consider subscribing if you find these chronicles as deeply unsettling as I do. It supports our work in covering the cases that many other channels refuse to confront. Arthur Freeman took his daughter's life from a bridge in the light of day, but the next father we will examine chose a location of deep isolation, driving his 3 sons into a dam on Father's Day and leaving them to drown in the darkness. Case 5. Robert Farquharson. On Sunday, September 4th, 2005, Father's Day in Australia, Robert Farquharson collected his 3 sons for a day of scheduled visitation. Jai was 10 years old, born in October 1994. Tyler was 7, born in July 1998. And Bailey was only 2 years old, born in December 2002. They were ordinary country boys, growing up in the community of Winchelsea, Victoria, a small town situated about 30 kilometers from Geelong. Their mother, Cindy, had seen them off in the car that morning, fully expecting their return that evening. But by nightfall, all 3 boys would be dead, submerged at the bottom of a dam, while their father would maintain it was all just a tragic accident. Robert Donald William Farquharson was a 36-year-old cleaner. He had first met Cindy Louise Gambino back in February of 1990. Their relationship lasted a decade before they married in the year 2000. But by the end of 2004, the marriage had completely disintegrated. They separated. Soon after, Cindy started a new life with another man, Stephen Mools. This development sent Robert into a rage. He could not process the reality that Cindy had moved on. He could not tolerate the idea of another man taking a fatherly role in his children's lives, and he began to speak of revenge. 2 months before that Father's Day in 2005, Robert had a conversation with a friend, a bus driver named Greg King. What Robert confessed to Greg that day would become the single most damning piece of evidence against him. Robert declared he was going to make Cindy pay back big time. He then outlined a plan for a staged accident, an accident involving a dam, an accident from which he would emerge as the sole survivor. He specifically chose Father's Day for his plan, he said, because it was a day everyone would remember. At the time, Greg King dismissed the conversation as an empty threat. It is a decision he would regret for the remainder of his life. On that Father's Day evening, Robert was behind the wheel of his white 1989 VN Holden Commodore, driving along the Prince's Highway near Winchelsea with his 3 sons as passengers. At approximately 7 o'clock that evening, the vehicle veered off the road and plunged into a 7.4-meter deep disused quarry dam. Robert Farquharson escaped the sinking car. He made it to the shore alone. Inside the submerged vehicle, his 3 sons drowned. Robert made no call to emergency services. He made no attempt to go back for his children. He did not cry out for help. His first action was to flag down a passing vehicle and ask the driver to take him to Cindy's house so that he could be the one to tell her what had occurred. When the driver suggested calling 000, Robert forbade it. When another person on the scene offered to call for help, Robert again refused. He was insistent on one thing: being driven to Cindy's home to deliver the news himself. When Robert Farquharson appeared on Cindy's doorstep, soaking wet, his message was simple. The car had gone into a dam, and the boys were gone. Cindy's screams shattered the stillness of the neighborhood, a primal sound that finally prompted a call to emergency services. Divers descended into the cold, dark water and soon recovered the bodies. Jai, the eldest, was found partially out of the passenger door. His younger brothers, Tyler and Bailey, were discovered in the back seat. The coroner confirmed all 3 boys had drowned. Their father, Robert, offered a story. He claimed a violent coughing fit had overcome him while he was driving. He told investigators he blacked out from the coughing, causing the car to veer off the road. He said he awoke submerged in water and managed to escape, but was unable to rescue his sons. To some, the account seemed plausible. It is medically possible for severe coughing spells to cause a person to lose consciousness. A tragic accident, perhaps. But then a man named Greg King came forward, telling investigators about a disturbing conversation he'd had with Robert just 2 months earlier, and accident reconstruction experts reached a chilling conclusion. A 220-degree turn of the steering wheel would have been required to plunge the car into that specific dam. A 220-degree turn is not an involuntary spasm. The first trial commenced on August 21, 2007, at the Supreme Court of Victoria, presided over by Justice Philip Cummins. In a stunning development, Cindy took the stand in Robert's defense. She could not bring herself to believe it was anything but an accident. The alternative that the father of her children had intentionally drowned them was simply too monstrous to comprehend. Greg King testified about his conversation with Robert. The prosecution painted a grim picture of a premeditated triple murder, an act of ultimate punishment directed at Cindy. On October 5, 2007, a jury found Robert Farquharson guilty, and he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms. But the case was far from over. On December 17, 2009, the Court of Appeal overturned the conviction, citing failures of disclosure during the trial. A retrial was mandated. The second trial began on May 4, 2010, this time before Justice Lex Lasry. Prosecutor Andrew Tinney, SC, presented the state's case once more. Defense counsel Peter Morrissey, SC, argued on Robert's behalf. On July 22, 2010, a second jury returned the same verdict: guilty. On October 15, 2010, Justice Lasry sentenced Robert to life in prison, setting a non-parole period of 33 years. He would not be eligible for release until 2043. The High Court denied his request for an appeal in 2013. Robert Farquharson is currently incarcerated at Bar 1 Prison in the Protection Unit. As of 2024, he is preparing another appeal. Cindy Gambino eventually found a measure of peace, marrying a man named Stephen Moss and having 2 more sons. She fought to rebuild a life from the ashes of her loss. But on May 10, 2022, Cindy died at University Hospital Geelong from a cardiac event. She was only 50 years old. She was laid to rest beside her 3 boys at Winchelsea Cemetery in January 2024. Robert Farquharson's name has been erased from the children's headstone. In their final resting place, The boys' graves no longer bear any trace of their father's existence. The author, Helen Garner, chronicled the harrowing case in her 2014 book, This House of Grief. Jai was 10 years old. Tyler was 7. Bailey was just 2. Their own father drove them into a dam on Father's Day, and then, by his own admission, twice refused to call for help, insisting he needed to deliver the news to their mother in person. He wanted to watch her face at the exact moment she learned her children were dead. While Robert Farquharson used a car as his instrument of death, the next father on our record chose something far more direct: a Glock pistol and 14 rounds of ammunition. Case 6. John Edwards. On Thursday, July 5, 2018, at 4:59 in the afternoon, a 67-year-old man named John Edwards steered a rented white Commodore into the driveway of 107 Hull Road in West Pennant Hills, Sydney. He had been stalking his 13-year-old daughter, shadowing her from the train station. Inside the home, his 15-year-old son, Jack, was absorbed in a game of Fortnite on his computer. His sister, Jennifer, had just arrived home from school. Their mother, Olga, was still at work. John Edwards walked into the house and discharged 14 rounds from a 9mm Glock pistol. He was inside for only 2 minutes and 11 seconds. Both children died from multiple gunshot wounds. John Edwards was born on July 12, 1950. He was a retired financial planner who had fathered 10 children across 6 different relationships. His history of domestic violence was long and well documented, stretching back to the 1990s with complaints from 5 former partners and 3 of his own children. One ex-wife had gone so far as to change her name and flee to Queensland just to escape him. But in spite of this extensive and violent history, the New South Wales Firearms Registry granted him gun licenses in both 2016 and 2017. 15 of the 18 entries in his police file were related to apprehended violence orders, stalking, or assault. Registry clerks, it was later found, lacked formal training and had failed to conduct proper background checks. John Edwards legally purchased 3 rifles and 2 pistols. His relationship with Olga Edwards, a 36-year-old Russian-born solicitor, had disintegrated years before. Olga had been granted primary custody of their 2 children, Jack and Jennifer. John was allowed only limited visitation rights. He stewed in this resentment. His resentment for Olga metastasized into a cold, calculated plan to take from her the only thing she truly loved. On July 5, 2018, Jennifer took the train home from her selective high school in Gosford. John followed her from the station, tracking her all the way to the house. Inside, Jack was still playing Fortnite. Hours later, when police entered the scene, the game was still running on his screen. Jennifer walked into her brother's room. John entered the house through a door that had been left unlocked. He shot Jack multiple times in the chest. Jack died there, in his gaming chair. Jennifer heard the shots and curled into a fetal position under Jack's desk. He located her and unleashed a barrage of bullets, striking her in the head, chest, abdomen, and limbs. In a final, desperate act, Jack attempted to use his own body as a shield for his sister. Both children perished inside Jack's bedroom. John Edwards departed the residence at 5:01 in the afternoon. The entire assault had concluded in 2 minutes and 11 seconds. He proceeded to his own home in Normanhurst, arriving shortly after 6 o'clock that evening. There, he used a .357 Magnum Smith & Wesson revolver to end his own life. He died at the scene. Olga Edwards returned home at approximately 6:30 that evening, only to be met by a wall of police. It was there that officers informed her that Jack and Jennifer were dead and that their father, John, was the one who had murdered them. 6 months later, on December 13, 2018, Olga also died by suicide within the same walls of that house. She was 37 years old. Authorities discovered her body during a welfare check. She could no longer bear the crushing weight of losing her children. Because John Edwards had taken his own life, there would be no criminal trial. Instead, a coroner's inquest was convened by New South Wales State Coroner Magistrate Teresa O'Sullivan. The hearings took place between September and November of 2020. The official findings were delivered on April 7, 2021. Within a 272-page report that included 24 formal recommendations, Coroner O'Sullivan delivered a damning conclusion. The evidence plainly reveals the deaths of Jack and Jennifer were preventable. The system for licensing firearms had failed on a catastrophic level. even though John Edwards' police record contained 15 separate entries related to domestic violence. Registry clerks had approved his gun licenses. Their checks were perfunctory. Their training was inadequate. They had failed to follow protocol, and as a direct result, 2 children were dead. The New South Wales Police Commissioner, Mick Fuller, offered a public apology. The state government declared its intention to reform the firearms licensing system. New protocols were enacted, demanding exhaustive background checks and specific screenings for domestic violence. The training regimen for registry staff was completely overhauled, but it changed nothing for Jack and Jennifer. Jack was 15 years old. He was an avid gamer and excelled in school. His entire future had been erased. Jennifer was just 13. She was a student at a selective high school, a brilliant young mind with plans for university, for a career, for a life. Their father had stalked Jennifer from the train station, walked into their sanctuary, and executed them both in Jack's bedroom while the boy played Fortnite. Olga Edwards had both of her children stolen from her in the space of a single afternoon. 6 months later, that unbearable grief drove her to take her own life. 3 deaths, 1 family annihilated all, because a violent man was granted access to weapons he never should have been allowed to touch. Before we proceed to our next case, if you find these stories as profoundly disturbing as I do, please consider subscribing. Your support enables us to continue shedding light on the cases that most other channels refuse to cover. John Edwards used a gun to murder his children in their own home. But the next father we will examine chose a method that required no weapon at all. He needed only a car, a bridge, and the capacity to throw 4 toddlers into freezing water. Case 7. Lam Luong. On Monday, January 7th, 2008, Lam Luong drove his car to the crest of the Dauphin Island Bridge in Mobile County, Alabama. This bridge, officially named the Gordon Persons Bridge, stretches across the Mississippi Sound. At its highest point, it rises approximately 85 feet above the water. Luong waited for the traffic to clear. Then, he opened the doors of his car and threw his 4 children, one by one, over the railing and into the water below. Ryan was 3 years old. Hannah was 2. Lindsay was 1. Danny was just 4 months old and had recently been hospitalized for a heart condition. All 4 were alive when he cast them from the bridge. Lam Luong was 37 years old and worked intermittently as a shrimp boat fisherman. He was a Malaysian, born in Vietnam to a Vietnamese mother and a Black American serviceman during the war. He had immigrated to the United States in 1984 as a refugee. His record included prior arrests for possession of crack cocaine in 1997, 2000, and as recently as October 2007. His life was unstable, a portrait of addiction and violence. He resided with his girlfriend, Kyu Nok Fan, who was 23 and worked in a nail salon. Ryan was her son from a previous relationship, but Luong had raised the boy as if he were his own. Hannah, Lindsay, and Danny were Luong's biological children with Kyu. Their life had spiraled after Hurricane Katrina devastated their home. The family was struggling financially, which is when Kyu discovered Luong's crack cocaine addiction. She finally left him, taking the children with her. On the morning of January 7th, at around 10 o'clock, Luong appeared at Kyu's nail salon. He demanded $31 for gas money. She refused him. In that moment, her refusal became his trigger. If he could not have her money, he would take from her what was most precious. He would take her children. Luong collected the children later that day under the pretense of a normal visitation. Kyu strapped them into the car herself. Ryan, the eldest, in the front passenger seat. Hannah, Lindsay, and Danny secured in the back. Kyu watched them drive away before returning to work. Luong drove directly to the Dauphin Island Bridge. He piloted the car to the bridge's highest point and stopped. He waited for a lull in the passing traffic. Then he opened the doors and began to systematically throw them over the railing, one after the other. He started with Ryan, the 3-year-old stepchild. Then came Hannah, age 2, after her 1-year-old Lindsay. And finally, Danny, just 4 months old, the same infant who had been hospitalized weeks before with heart problems. Every one of the 4 children was conscious as he cast them over the edge. They all fell 85 feet into the Mississippi Sound. Recovery of their bodies would take the next 2 weeks. The currents within the Mississippi Sound are notoriously strong and unpredictable. Danny was discovered 12 miles from the bridge. Ryan was located 16 miles away. Lindsay's body was recovered 18 miles distant in the state of Mississippi. Hannah had been carried the farthest. Her body was found 144 miles away in Louisiana. That night, Lamb told the children's mother, Q, that they were with someone else. She trusted him. The following day, January 8th, he confessed. He informed her that all 4 children were dead. Q would later tell investigators that as he confessed, Lamb kept laughing. He was laughing. His children were gone, lost to the bottom of the Mississippi Sound, and he found it amusing. He claimed their bodies would never be located. Detectives who interviewed Lamb later stated that he told them his goal was to see his wife's face when she learned he had murdered all 4 of her children. That was his objective, not merely to end the children's lives, but to witness her expression at the moment of realization, to watch her be destroyed. Q's statement to the media became one of the most devastating remarks in the entire case. Why didn't he kill me instead of the children? The trial was convened in Mobile County, with Circuit Judge Charles Graddick presiding. District Attorney John Tyson Jr. led the prosecution. On March 19, 2009, Lam Luong was convicted on 4 separate counts of capital murder. On April 29, 2009, Judge Graddick imposed the death penalty. But with it came a highly unusual order. He instructed prison officials to show Lam Luong photographs of all 4 children every single day while he was on death row. Each morning, guards were under orders to present him with the images of Ryan, Hannah, Lindsay, and Danny. However, in 2018, subsequent IQ testing revealed that Lam Luong had an IQ of 51. Under the Supreme Court's Atkins v. Virginia ruling, individuals with established intellectual disabilities cannot be executed. On October 15, 2018, Judge James Patterson vacated the death sentence, resentencing Lam Luong to life without the possibility of parole. Judge Patterson noted that Luong richly deserves to die, but that the law, based on his intellectual disability, required the sentence to be commuted. Lam Luong is currently serving his sentence of life without parole within the Alabama Department of Corrections. In May of 2008, a granite memorial was placed at Maritime Park in Bayou La Batre, honoring Ryan, Hannah, Lindsay, and Danny. Ryan was 3 years old, Hannah was 2, Lindsay was 1, and Danny was 4 months old. Their father had thrown them from a bridge into freezing water because their mother had denied him $31 for gas. He laughed during his confession. He wanted to witness her face when she found out they were gone. While Lam Luong dispatched his children from a bridge in a span of minutes, the next father on record would take 5 hours to systematically extinguish the lives of all 5 of his children inside their home before transporting their bodies across state lines. Case 8. Timothy Jones Jr. On Thursday, August 28, 2014, Timothy Ray Jones Jr. murdered all 5 of his children inside their mobile home on South Lake Drive in the Red Bank area of Lexington County, South Carolina. The killings transpired over a period of approximately 5 hours. When it was done, he placed their bodies in his SUV and drove through the southeast for 9 days, covering over 700 miles before leaving them along a logging road near Camden, Alabama. He was still traveling with the 5 decomposing bodies in his vehicle when authorities finally stopped him at a routine traffic checkpoint. Timothy Ray Jones Jr. was born on December 28, 1981. He was 32 years old and employed as a computer engineer for Intel, earning between $71,000 and $82,000 a year. He was a graduate of Mississippi State University, class of 2011. His mother suffered from diagnosed schizophrenia. Timothy was self-medicating with synthetic marijuana, using the substance up to 5 times per day. He was becoming paranoid, increasingly unpredictable, and was losing his grasp on reality. Timothy had married a woman named Amber Kaiser in June of 2004 when she was 18 and he was 22. Together, they had 5 children. Natan Head Jones was born in 2008, Mara Gracie Jones in 2006, Elias Javier Jones in 2007, Gabriel Asher Jones in 2012, and Abigail Elaine Jones in 2013. All of them attended Saxe Gotha Elementary or a local daycare. But Timothy's behavior had become controlling. He monitored Amber constantly. The marriage had become an oppressive environment. In 2013, Amber had an affair. Timothy initiated divorce proceedings. The divorce was made final in October of 2013. In a legal ruling that would torment Amber for the rest of her life, the court granted primary custody of the children to Timothy. Amber did not have the financial means to contest the decision. The judge saw a computer engineer with a stable income. Amber was granted limited visitation. The South Carolina Department of Social Services had visited Timothy's home on approximately a dozen occasions between 2011 and 2014. On August 13, 2014, just 15 days prior to the murders, a DSS social worker made a note that Timothy appears to be overwhelmed. A social worker had documented bruises on the children, but the investigation remained open when their lives were taken. On August 28, Timothy concluded that the children were an impediment to his work, a job he had already lost, having been fired from Intel weeks prior. He was consuming synthetic marijuana multiple times a day, and he directed the blame toward his own children. 6-year-old Natan was subjected to punitive physical exercises. While the exact mechanism of Natan's death is officially undetermined, one fact is certain: he was the first to die. Timothy then strangled 8-year-old Mira with his bare hands. He did the same to 7-year-old Elias. He used a belt on 2-year-old Gabriel. He used a belt on 1-year-old Abigail. The entire sequence of killings unfolded over approximately 5 hours. He dispatched them methodically, one child at a time. After the murders were complete, Timothy wrapped their bodies and loaded them into his SUV. Then he began to drive. For 9 days, he traversed South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi with the 5 decomposing bodies of his children in the vehicle. He refueled at gas stations. He ate meals in restaurants. He slept in his car. On September 6, 2014, Timothy's journey was intercepted at a routine checkpoint in Smith County, Mississippi. The officers were immediately confronted by a putrid odor. Inside the vehicle, they discovered blood, maggots, and other physical evidence of decomposition. Timothy was taken into custody. For 2 days, he weathered the investigators' interrogation. Then, finally, he broke. He confessed, leading officers to the location where he had discarded the bodies, a remote logging road near Camden, Alabama. The trial convened at the Lexington County Court of General Sessions, with Judge Eugene C. Griffith Jr. presiding. The prosecution was handled by Solicitor Rick Hubbard. Defense attorney Boyd Young presented an insanity defense. The prosecution, however, argued that Timothy's actions demonstrated a clear and calculated mind. He killed the children. He wrapped their bodies. He drove for 9 days, attempting to conceal his crime. On June 4, 2019, following 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict, finding Timothy Jones Jr. guilty on 5 counts of murder. On June 13, 2019, after deliberating for just 1 hour and 45 minutes, that same jury sentenced him to death. During the sentencing phase, the children's mother, Amber Kaiser, took the stand. What she said to the jury was nothing short of extraordinary. "He did not show my children mercy by any means, but my kids loved him, and if I'm speaking on behalf of my kids, that's what I have to say." She informed the jury that she would accept their decision, whatever it might be. She was there only to speak for her children, who had loved their father even as he was killing them. Timothy Jones Jr. is currently an inmate on death row at Kirkland Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. The South Carolina Supreme Court affirmed both his conviction and his sentence on March 29, 2023. In July 2024, Amber settled a lawsuit against the South Carolina Department of Social Services for $1.5 million. DSS had been to the home a dozen times. They had documented the bruises. They had noted that Timothy was overwhelmed, yet they failed to remove the children from his care. Natan was 6 years old. Mira was 8. Elias was 7. Gabriel was 2. Abigail was 1. Their father strangled them, choked them with belts, and drove with their bodies for 9 days before dumping them on a logging road like refuse. Before we proceed to the next case, if you find these stories as profoundly disturbing as I do, please consider subscribing. It supports our efforts to cover the cases that most other channels will not investigate. Timothy Jones Jr. murdered his children in private and then attempted to hide the evidence. But the next father on our list made certain his ex-wife would be an auditory witness to his final act. A social worker was pounding on the door at the exact moment the house exploded with 2 young boys trapped inside. Case 9. Josh Powell. On Sunday, February 5, 2012, at approximately 12:05 in the afternoon, a social worker by the name of Elizabeth Griffin Hall brought 2 young boys to their father's house for a court-supervised visit. Charlie was 7 years old. Braden was 5. They were reportedly excited to see their dad. The boys ran ahead to the front door of the house at 81 19th Street Court East in Graham, Washington. Their father, Joshua Powell, opened the door, telling them he had a big surprise. He then pulled both boys into the house and slammed the door in the social worker's face. She was immediately struck by the smell of gasoline. She began pounding on the door. She called 911. The dispatcher wasted precious moments with irrelevant questions. It took 21 minutes for officers to arrive. 2 minutes after that initial 911 call, the house detonated. Joshua Powell had attacked his sons with a hatchet, saturated the house in gasoline, and then triggered an explosion that killed all 3 of them. Joshua Stephen Powell was born on January 20th, 1976. He was 36 years old. He was already the sole person of interest in the 2009 disappearance of his wife, Susan. On December 6, 2009, Susan Marie Powell had vanished from their home in West Valley City, Utah. Josh's alibi was that he had taken their 2 toddlers camping at midnight in freezing temperatures. No one believed him. A handwritten will left by Susan stated in clear terms, "If I die, it may not be an accident." Police suspected Josh had murdered her, but her body was never found. They never had sufficient evidence to charge him. After Susan vanished, Josh moved with his sons into his father, Stephen Powell's, home in Puyallup, Washington. In September of 2011, another layer of the Powell family's darkness was exposed when Stephen Powell was taken into custody, charged with voyeurism for the clandestine recording of women and young girls. Following Stephen's arrest, Charlie and Braden were placed in the care of their maternal grandparents, Chuck and Judy Cox. The Coxes adored their grandsons and fought with a desperate urgency to shield them, because they held a chilling certainty about the danger Josh posed. They knew what he was capable of and what they believed he had done to Susan. On February 1st, 2012, the justice system made a decisive move. A judge formally denied Josh custody and mandated a full psychosexual evaluation. The walls were closing in on Josh Powell. He was losing control. It became clear he was never going to reclaim his sons. 4 days later, on February 5th, he arrived at a chilling resolution. If he couldn't have them, then nobody would. For the past 3 months, a woman named Elizabeth Griffin Hall had been supervising the visits between Josh and his sons. She was an agent of the Foster Care Resource Network, a professional buffer in a volatile family dynamic. On that February 5th, she escorted Charlie and Braden to Josh's rental house for a routine, supervised visit. The boys were filled with innocent excitement, running ahead toward the front door. Josh greeted them with the promise of a big surprise. As Charlie and Braden rushed past him into the house, he grabbed them, and the door slammed shut, locking Elizabeth out. The acrid smell of gasoline hit her instantly. A wave of panic took hold. She hammered her fists against the door, screaming for Josh to open it. There was only silence from within. Elizabeth dialed 911. The voice that answered belonged to a dispatcher named David Lovack, and her words to him were chillingly precise. Josh Powell, she reported, would not let her inside the door, and the situation could be life-threatening. Lovack's response was a cascade of procedural questions, beginning with her address. He probed for details of the custody arrangement, seemingly confused over whether to dispatch law enforcement or social services. Elizabeth was frantic. The unmistakable odor of gasoline was a harbinger of something monstrous, but the sheer urgency of her terror was completely lost on the dispatcher. From the start of the call to the arrival of officers, 21 minutes would pass, 21 agonizing minutes. Just 2 minutes into Elizabeth's call, the house detonated. Before the blast, Josh Powell had attacked his sons, Charlie and Braden, with a hatchet. Charlie sustained a devastating chop wound to his neck. Braden suffered similar brutal injuries to his head and neck. With his children assaulted, Josh then saturated the home with gasoline and triggered the massive explosion. The official cause of death for all 3 was determined to be carbon monoxide poisoning. Among the debris, investigators noted that Charlie had slept under a Spider-Man bedspread. Braden's bed had been made with Disney Cars pillow sheets. These small, heartbreaking details of 2 young lives were meticulously documented as investigators sorted through the wreckage. "He exploded the house," Elizabeth screamed into the phone. "He blew up the house and the kids." She was hysterical, a witness to the murder of 2 children. David Lovac was later formally reprimanded for his critical mishandling of the 911 call. His delays may have been the deciding factor in whether Charlie and Braden lived or died. There would be no trial, as Josh Powell had executed himself in the explosion. Instead, Chuck and Judy Cox pursued another form of justice, filing a wrongful death lawsuit against the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services. Their argument was devastatingly simple. Social workers, fully aware of the risks, should never have allowed the supervised visits to continue. Josh was the prime suspect in a murder. His father was a convicted sex offender. By any rational measure, the house was not a safe place for children. In July of 2020, a Pierce County jury validated their claim, awarding Chuck and Judy Cox $98.5 million. A court of appeals would later reinstate this amount in 2023. Attorney Ann Brenner had represented the Cox family. Josh's father, Stephen Powell, was convicted on May 16, 2012, of 14 counts of voyeurism. He died on July 23, 2018, at the age of 68. The family's dark legacy continued when Josh's brother, Michael Powell, died by suicide on February 11, 2013. He was 30 years old. Investigators strongly believe Michael had helped Josh conceal Susan's body. The weight of that secret, it seems, became too much to bear. Susan Powell has never been found. Officially, her case remains open but cold. Her family is certain Josh killed her and buried her remains, somewhere in the vast Utah desert. They believe Michael was his accomplice, but without a body, there can be no murder conviction. Charlie was 7 years old. Braden was 5. They ran to their father's door, excited to see him, anticipating the surprise he had promised. That surprise was an attack with a hatchet, a house doused in gasoline, and a final, obliterating blast. A social worker stood on the porch, pounding on a locked door while 2 little boys died inside. A 911 dispatcher asked irrelevant questions for 21 minutes while the house burned. Josh Powell had murdered his wife, and he had gotten away with it. His final act was to murder his sons, a calculated cruelty designed to make Susan's parents suffer an unimaginable loss. While Josh Powell used an explosion to annihilate his children and himself, another case presents a different kind of horror. The next father survived his own attack, and in doing so, forced his daughter to witness him murder her little brother. This is Case 10, Christopher Hawkins. On Sunday, September 23, 2007, inside a terraced house on Royd Street in Huddersfield, England, Christopher Hawkins methodically stabbed his 2 children. His 4-year-old son, Ryan, was stabbed 9 times and died from his injuries. His 14-year-old daughter, Donna, was stabbed at least 13 times and survived. The attack was carried out just 1 week after Ryan's 4th birthday party. It transpired one day after Christopher and his wife had marked their 17th wedding anniversary. Christopher Hawkins was 47 years old, a sheet metal worker by trade who had married Valerie Hawkins back in 1990. Their union produced 3 children: Natalie, who was 16, Donna at 14, and the youngest, Ryan, only 4 years old. From the outside, the marriage projected an image of normalcy for years. But behind closed doors, Christopher was a violent man, a heavy drinker with a well-documented history of domestic abuse. The abuse was escalating. It included punching Valerie on Christmas Eve, attempting to throttle her, and in January of 2007, spitting on her. He tried to strangle Valerie as she held their infant son, Ryan. By July 2007, the violence had reached a new peak. Valerie alleged he held her prisoner and raped her at knife point. In May of 2007, Valerie finally told Christopher that she no longer loved him. She started a new relationship with a taxi driver named Lee Tinker. The news sent Christopher into a rage. He was fundamentally unable to accept that his marriage had ended. Her moving on was a reality he could not process. Investigators would later discover notes in his bedroom, a chilling glimpse into his state of mind. They read, "Me and Ryan are going to heaven on September 16th, and to Val, who I will love forever, that's why me and my son are going to die." On September 23rd, Donna went to the house to pick up her younger brother, Ryan. Her father opened the door and uttered 2 words, "I'm sorry." And then the assault began. He lunged at her with a knife, stabbing her again and again. She fought for her life, her screams piercing the air. In a desperate attempt to reason with him, she told him she didn't hate him. The stabbing stopped, And then he spoke a sentence that would echo in her memory forever. "I'm going to kill Ryan now." Donna tried to intervene, but her injuries were too severe. She managed to escape the house, only to collapse on the street outside. Her fall was witnessed by a shopkeeper, Wakazar Zaman, and his assistant, Michelle White, who saw her bleeding profusely on the pavement. Their immediate first aid response is what ultimately saved her life. Donna had sustained at least 13 separate stab wounds, covering her face, chest, abdomen, arm, and thigh. 2 of the wounds to her abdomen had pierced her liver. Another had collapsed her lung. Medically, she should not have survived. But Zaman and White's intervention kept her alive until emergency services arrived. While they fought to save a life, Christopher Hawkins was inside, methodically taking one. He stabbed his 4-year-old son, Ryan, 9 times. 2 of those wounds struck the boy's heart directly. In his final moments, Ryan attempted to defend himself, raising his small hands against the blade. The medical examiner would later identify defensive wounds, clear evidence that 4-year-old Ryan had fought to stay alive. Just 1 week prior, on September 16th, he had celebrated his birthday. Against his own father, he never stood a chance. After murdering his son, Christopher exhibited a chilling lack of emotion. He walked to the Silent Woman pub on Nabbs Lane, went inside, and ordered a pint of beer. He then sat down with a friend, a man named Robert Burns, and confessed that he had just stabbed his children. Afterward, he made his way to a nearby churchyard, which is where police finally took him into custody. To the arresting officers, he said, "I will commit suicide for what I've done. I've stabbed my son and my daughter." He then offered his motive: "Because my wife is having an affair and I took it out on them." The case went to trial at Leeds Crown Court in March of 2008. The Honorable Mr. Justice Wilkie presided over the proceedings. Prosecutor Simon Mears QC laid out the case for the Crown, and the evidence against Hawkins was staggering. Christopher had already confessed. His daughter, Donna, had survived to give her testimony. It took the jury less than 3 hours to return a guilty verdict for both murder and attempted murder. On the day of sentencing, Justice Wilkie addressed Christopher directly. "I am satisfied you used Ryan cold-heartedly as a vehicle for avenging your wife." With that, he sentenced Christopher to life in prison, with a minimum term of 21 years for the murder. For the attempted murder, he received an additional 12 years, to be served concurrently. Christopher's minimum tariff expires in 2029. Donna was later honored with the Diana Award for her work in fundraising for a memorial to her brother at the Mill Hill Recreation Ground. She has since dedicated years to raising public awareness about the realities of domestic violence. She transformed her personal trauma into a public cause. By 2017, reports began to surface that Christopher Hawkins was being granted supervised day release from prison. Donna lives on, bearing the permanent physical and psychological scars from that day in September when her own father stabbed her 13 times and then murdered her little brother. Ryan was only 4 years old. Just 1 week before his death, he had celebrated his birthday. His father stabbed him 9 times. The boy had tried to fight back, raising his small hands in a futile attempt to survive, leaving defensive wounds that told the story of his final moments. His sister, Donna, was 14. She survived 13 stab wounds, but was forced to listen as her father announced his intention to kill her brother. And then he carried it out. Christopher Hawkins murdered his own son and attempted to murder his daughter, all as an act of punishment against the wife who had left him. He offered no mystery as to his motive, telling police exactly why he did it. His wife was having an affair, so he exacted his revenge on their children. The human capacity for such calculated cruelty is deeply unsettling. If you believe these stories demand to be told, your support ensures we can continue to investigate them. It allows us to shed light on the cases that many others would prefer to leave in the shadows. Christopher Hawkins used a knife in the family home, but the father in our next case selected a slower, more torturous method. He forced his ex-wife to listen, live on the phone, as he ended the lives of their 4 sons with carbon monoxide in a desolate roadside pull-off. This is Case 11, Keith Young. On the night of Thursday, March 27, 2003, a man named Keith Young drove his 4 sons to an isolated pull-off near the Ponderosa Cafe, located on the Horseshoe Pass near Llangollen, North Wales. There was Joshua, age 7, Thomas, age 6, Callum, age 5, and Daniel, who was only 3. Their father had told them they were all going on an adventure. Model. He had the children change into their pajamas, arranging them with pillows and quilts in the back of the family's Mitsubishi Shogun. To the boys, this was the start of a camping adventure. They were oblivious to the fact their father was driving them toward their own deaths. Keith Young was a 38-year-old farm laborer and pub bouncer, a resident of Winsford, Cheshire. His relationship with Samantha Tully had started when she was a girl of only 14, while he was a man of approximately 24. Their relationship spanned years before they were finally married in June of 2001. Throughout the marriage, Samantha was subjected to unrelenting domestic violence. In one such assault, Keith fractured her wrist. The beatings were a constant reality. He maintained absolute control over every detail of her existence. Following a particularly vicious attack on Christmas of 2002, Samantha finally made her escape. She managed to get court orders issued against Keith, and in January of 2003, moved with her sons to Weaver, where she began a new relationship. By March of 2003, she discovered she was 5 weeks pregnant with her new partner's child. When she relayed this information to Keith during a shopping trip, it became what a coroner would later describe as the catalyst, stating, "I believe your pregnancy was the trigger." Just 2 days before the murders, Keith confessed to someone that if he was not allowed to have Samantha, he had no desire for the children either. On the evening of March 27th, Keith arrived. The final drive took them to Horseshoe Pass, where Keith pulled over into the lay-by adjacent to the Ponderosa Cafe. He made sure the boys were comfortable in the back, tucked in with their pillows and quilts, and they drifted off to sleep without a fuss. From the rear of the Shogun, Keith retrieved a gasoline-powered lawnmower and positioned it within the vehicle's interior. Then, he turned the key in its ignition. Carbon monoxide, invisible and silent, started to saturate the confined atmosphere. The sleeping children never stirred. As the poison thickened the air, Keith placed a call to Samantha. She picked up the phone, anticipating a routine call. Instead, she was met with his cold instruction: "Save your breath." His voice followed, laced with venom. "I hope you are happy. I hope you have a grudge against that baby for the rest of your life." In that moment, the cold dread of understanding began to creep in. He asked her if she could discern the sound of the running lawnmower. She confirmed she could. Then he posed another question. Could she hear her children? She answered yes. It was then that Keith made Samantha an unwilling audience to the systematic extermination of their sons. At approximately 1:15 in the morning, Keith's voice came through the line, flat and final. "It's too late. Dan's dead." 3-year-old Daniel was the first to perish. Samantha's screams and pleas for him to stop were met with cold refusal. Then, Keith put 7-year-old Joshua on the phone. He compelled the boy to say a final goodbye to his mother, to tell her that he loved her. Joshua, his consciousness already fading from the gas, managed to whisper, "Goodbye, Mommy. I love you." The phone was then returned to Keith, who proceeded to provide a chilling play-by-play of each child's death. Thomas was next, then Callum, and finally, Joshua. Samantha was forced to listen to the entire ordeal. For hours, she was held captive on the line as Keith carried out the murders of their sons. She heard their desperate struggle for air. She heard the silences that followed, one by one. Hanging up was not an option. Keith kept her on the line, narrating the horror as it unfolded. A police trace on the mobile signal led authorities to Horseshoe Pass. At roughly 2 o'clock in the morning on March 28th, Police Constable Andy Phillips discovered the vehicle parked in the lay-by. He shattered the passenger side window with his baton, and the small body of a boy tumbled out from the footwell. Inside, all 4 children and Keith were lifeless. The engine of the lawnmower was still running. A home office pathologist would later confirm that the method of death would have been without pain. The carbon monoxide would have induced a deep drowsiness, pulling the boys into a final sleep from which they would never awaken. They died believing they were on a camping trip, but for Samantha, the suffering was absolute. She had been made to hear everything. An inquest convened on September 16, 2003, at the Wrexham Coroner's Court. John Hughes, the coroner for Northeast Wales, recorded a verdict of unlawful killing for all 4 boys and suicide for Keith. Hughes described it as one of the most harrowing cases he had ever encountered. He admitted to Samantha that her testimony was among the most profoundly difficult things he had ever been forced to hear. The tragedy did not end there. Samantha also lost the unborn child she was carrying. Weeks later, the immense stress and psychological trauma induced a miscarriage. And so, Keith's final act of vengeance didn't just claim the lives of Joshua, Thomas, Callum, and Daniel. He also extinguished the life of the child Samantha was pregnant with. 5 children, all gone, because their father could not tolerate the idea of their mother moving on. A memorial plaque was later installed at Horseshoe Pass, the site where the boys drew their last breaths. At Handley Hill Primary School in Winsford, which the boys had attended, a memorial garden was planted in their memory. Joshua was 7 years old, Thomas was 6, Callum was 5, and Daniel was just 3. Their father murdered them with carbon monoxide gas, forcing their mother to bear witness over the telephone. He made her listen to each of them as they died. He put his eldest son, Joshua, on the line and made him say his last goodbyes. And then he killed him, too. While Keith Young was ending his children's lives on a desolate mountain pass, another father selected a similarly remote location in Snowdonia, leaving behind explosive devices at his home as one last, twisted message for his ex-wife. Case 12. Brian Philcox. On Saturday, June 14, 2008, Brian Philcox steered his light blue Land Rover Freelander to a secluded spot just off the A470, somewhere between Mantrog and Talibant, in the Conwy Valley of Snowdonia, Wales. It was the very day his divorce was officially finalized. The following day, Father's Day, a person passing by would discover the 3 bodies. 7-year-old Amy Philcox and 3-year-old Owen Philcox were discovered dead inside a vehicle alongside their father. The investigation revealed a horrifying sequence. Brian had incapacitated them with chloroform and a sleeping drug before pumping exhaust fumes into the car. The coroner's report offered a single, grim consolation. The children would have been completely unaware of what was happening. Brian Philcox was 52 years old, a man with a public image built on discipline and control, a karate instructor, a security guard, and the chairman of the Federation of English Karate Organizations. He was from Runcorn, Cheshire. His first wife, Jan, had passed away from Hodgkin's disease. He later remarried a 37-year-old woman named Lynn McAuliffe. They would have 2 children together. Amy was 7, Owen was 3. Brian also publicly aligned himself with Fathers for Justice, a controversial advocacy group known for its aggressive tactics in fathers' rights and custody disputes. In August of 2007, the facade of their family life crumbled. Lynn fled with the children to her mother's house, escaping what she described as years of controlling behavior. He was a man consumed by jealousy, possessiveness, and a capacity for violence. He monitored her phone calls and demanded to know her every move. Lynn confessed a deep and specific fear to those close to her. She was terrified that Brian might one day harm the children. By April of 2008, the courts had made their decision. Warrington County Court granted sole residency to Lynn, with Brian allowed unsupervised access. The ruling infuriated him. He felt profoundly betrayed by the legal system. On June 14, 2008, the divorce decree became final. The official paperwork arrived at his home that morning. The marriage was legally dissolved. That very day, he picked up Amy and Owen for a scheduled visit. Lynn embraced them, watched them get into Brian's Land Rover, and drive away. He wasn't taking them to the park. He was driving them to a secluded location in Snowdonia. He pulled off the A470, parking in an isolated spot where they were unlikely to be found. It was there he gave Amy and Owen chloroform and a powerful sedative. The children became drowsy, and in the back seat, they drifted off to sleep. They would not wake up again. With his children unconscious, Brian then piped carbon monoxide from the vehicle's exhaust into the cabin. Amy was 7 years old. Owen was 3. They died peacefully in their sleep, never knowing their own father was ending their lives. But for Brian, this was not the end. He had planned one final, devastating act of revenge. He had rigged the family home with homemade explosive devices. A note was glued to the kitchen worktop, designed to detonate if anyone attempted to move it. A second device was concealed under the kitchen table. A third was sent through the mail to Lynn's son, Ryan, timed to arrive on Monday, June 16th. The discovery of his plan forced the evacuation of around 40 residents while bomb disposal teams worked to dismantle the devices. On Saturday evening, just before he ended his own life, Brian called Lynn and left a voicemail. He repeated, in a flat tone, "There's nothing I can do. It's out of my control now." His voice was chillingly calm. Then, he delivered a threat. "I have left you a present. I'll make the papers. Just you wait." Hearing the message, a cold dread washed over Lynn. She tried calling him back, but the calls went unanswered. All through the night, she tried his mobile phone, over and over. There was only silence. The next morning, on Father's Day, a passerby noticed the Land Rover parked in the remote clearing. The windows were fogged. Peering inside, the person saw bodies. A call was made immediately to the police. Arriving officers confirmed the horrific scene. All three were deceased. Amy and Owen were in the back seat, tucked neatly under blankets. Brian was in the driver's seat. A formal inquest was later held in Llandudno. The coroner for Northeast Wales, John Gittins, recorded the official cause of death as unlawful killing for both children and suicide for Brian. The inquest reviewed the mountain of evidence: the toxicology reports showing chloroform and sleeping drugs, the sophisticated explosive devices at the home, and the haunting voicemail Brian had left behind. Coroner Gittins addressed Lynn directly, stating, "When he took Amy and Owen from you, his intention was that they would be lost to you forever. But he failed because their lives are imprinted on your heart." Lynn herself described Brian as a cold-blooded, premeditated killer. She testified that Brian had planned every single component of his horrific act: the drugs to ensure the children were sedated, the isolated location, the bombs, the final, taunting voicemail. His ultimate goal was her complete annihilation. He planned to take her children from her and then take her life with an explosion. The case was dissected in the Channel 4 documentary series Dispatches in 2008. The police investigation was led by Detective Chief Inspector Wayne Jones of North Wales Police. Amy was 7 years old. Owen was 3. On the day their divorce was finalized, their father drugged them so they wouldn't awaken, then poisoned them with carbon monoxide. He left explosive devices rigged at their home to murder their mother. He left her a voicemail promising a present and boasting that he would make the papers. 2 children lost their lives on Father's Day because their father refused to accept that his marriage was over. Before we proceed to the next file, if you find this kind of deep dive into the human psyche compelling, your subscription allows us to continue investigating the cases that are often left in the shadows. Brian Phil Cox chose carbon monoxide and explosives as his instruments of revenge. But our next case involves a father in Canada who used a knife and then argued that a mental breakdown should shield him entirely from criminal responsibility. Guy Turcotte. On the night of February 20th, 2009, in the wealthy Montreal suburb of Piedmont, Quebec, Dr. Guy Turcotte stabbed his 2 children to death. Olivier was 5 years old, and Anne-Sophie was 3. Guy had stabbed them a combined 46 times. Olivier had suffered 27 wounds. Anne-Sophie had been stabbed 19 times. Afterward, he ingested 2 bottles of windshield washer fluid in what appeared to be a suicide attempt. He would survive. His children would not. Guy Turcotte was 34 years old, a cardiologist practicing at the Hôtel Dieu de Saint-Jérôme in Montreal. By all accounts, he was successful, respected, and highly compensated. He had married Isabelle Gaston in 2001. They resided in a picturesque home in Piedmont and had brought 2 children into the world. Olivier was born in 2003, and his sister, Anne-Sophie, was born in 2005. To any outside observer, they were the embodiment of a perfect family: a physician father, a doting mother, and 2 beautiful children. But behind closed doors, the marriage was disintegrating. Isabelle had started an affair with a man named Martin Huot in late 2008. In January of 2009, she informed Guy that she wanted a divorce. The news shattered him. He was incapable of processing that his marriage was over. He could not reconcile himself to the fact that Isabelle had chosen another man over him. On February 20th, 2009, Isabelle left for the evening to be with Martin Huot. Guy was at home, alone with Olivier and Anne-Sophie. Later that evening, Guy put his children to bed. Olivier was in his bedroom and Anne-Sophie was in hers. Sometime after, Guy entered Olivier's room, armed with a kitchen knife. He then stabbed his 5-year-old son 27 times. Olivier had fought back. The wounds on his hands were a testament to his struggle to survive, but he was only 5 years old. He stood no chance against an armed adult. After killing his son, Guy entered Anne-Sophie's bedroom. He plunged the knife into his 3-year-old daughter 19 times. Anne-Sophie was too small to defend herself. She died in her own bed. With both his children dead, Guy then drank 2 full bottles of methanol, the toxic chemical used in windshield washer fluid. His intent was to die, to join his children in a final, horrific act, but the poison failed to kill him. The following morning, a relative discovered the scene. Guy, unconscious, surrounded by the bodies of Olivier and Anne-Sophie. The authorities were immediately summoned. Guy was transported to the hospital, where he ultimately recovered. He was subsequently charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. His first trial began in 2011 at the Saint-Jérôme courthouse. The core of his defense was the argument that a mental disorder rendered him not criminally responsible for his actions. His legal team asserted that he had been consumed by extreme emotional turmoil, which had triggered a complete mental collapse. The jury was presented with extensive testimony regarding Guy's psychological state on the night he killed his children. On July 5, 2011, the jury delivered its verdict. Guy was not criminally responsible due to a mental disorder. This meant he would not be incarcerated in a prison. Instead, the court ordered him confined to a psychiatric institution. The outcome ignited a firestorm of controversy. Across Quebec, public outrage was palpable. The prevailing belief was that Guy had committed a calculated act of vengeance and deserved to be imprisoned for life. The Crown Prosecutor's Office appealed the verdict. In 2013, the Quebec Court of Appeal overturned the decision and mandated a new trial. The second trial commenced in 2015. This time, prosecutors introduced new evidence detailing Guy's behavior before and after the killings, arguing that his actions were methodical and lucid. He had followed the children's normal bedtime routine. The murder weapon was a kitchen knife taken from his own home. He had stabbed each child repeatedly. The prosecution argued these were not the actions of a man who was disconnected from reality. On December 6, 2015, the second jury found Guy Turcotte guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder, a conviction that carries an automatic life sentence in Canada. The law left it to the judge to set the period of parole ineligibility, a window that can span from 10 to 25 years. The judge sentenced Guy to life in prison, stipulating he could not apply for parole for 17 years. Guy would not serve that minimum sentence. In 2019, after a combined total of roughly 10 years in psychiatric care in prison, Turcotte was granted day parole. By 2022, he had been granted full parole. He now walks free, living under supervision within the community. He is legally prohibited from making any contact with Isabelle Gaston or any of her relatives. Isabelle has become a public voice in the aftermath of the murders, stating that she can never forgive what Guy did to Olivier and Anne-Sophie. She has described the parole board's decision as a profound betrayal of her children's memory. She is a constant visitor to their graves. Olivier was 5 years old. His sister, Anne-Sophie, was 3. Their father inflicted a combined 46 stab wounds upon them because their mother had moved on with a new man. Olivier was stabbed 27 times. The wounds on Olivier's hands showed he fought to stay alive. Anne-Sophie was stabbed 19 times. Her father then attempted to take his own life, a final act to evade consequence. He failed. He lived. He served 10 years, and then he was set free. Guy Turcotte murdered his children while their mother was building a new life. He then hid behind a defense of mental illness to shirk responsibility. But he was not alone. In British Columbia, another father would suffocate and strangle his 3 children and managed to avoid a prison cell entirely. Case 14. Alan Schoenborn. On the afternoon of April 5, 2008, in the small community of Merritt, British Columbia, Alan Schoenborn murdered his 3 children. Caitlin was 10 years old. Max was 8. Corden was 5. The methods were intimate, brutal, and distinct. For Caitlin, a pillow. For Max, a plastic bag. For Cordon, bare hands. The scene was a quiet domestic nightmare. 3 children, dead in their own home, their mother away at her job. The architect of this horror was their father, Alan Schoenborn, a 40-year-old man whose life was a documented spiral of mental illness, addiction, and violence. His medical files painted a grim portrait, a catalog of psychiatric diagnoses stretching back years. Treatment facilities had become revolving doors. His relationship with the children's mother, Darcy Clark, was a landscape of volatility and abuse. Darcy had tried to escape his violence before, leaving him on multiple occasions. She had sought the protection of the courts, securing restraining orders that proved to be little more than paper shields. He always found a way back into their lives. In March of 2008, Darcy made a final break. She sought refuge in a mobile home in Merritt, taking Caitlin, Max, and Corden with her, and finding work at a local Walmart. She was attempting to construct a stable existence for her children, a life free from his shadow. But in Alan's mind, her departure wasn't an ending. It was an unforgivable transgression. his thoughts fixated on a singular, corrosive idea. Darcy was with other men. He believed she had chosen someone else over him. On April 5, 2008, Darcy was at Walmart, working an afternoon shift. The children were at home, alone in the mobile home. That's when Alan appeared, forcing his way into the sanctuary she had tried to build. What unfolded inside was not an act of passion, but of cold, horrific deliberation. He went to Caitlin's room first. He pressed a pillow over the face of his 10-year-old daughter. The evidence showed Caitlin fought for her life, a desperate struggle against a man who would not be stopped. She died there, in her own bedroom. From there, he moved to Max's room, where he used a plastic bag on his 8-year-old son. Max, too, resisted. He fought to escape, but his father held the bag tight over his head, waiting until the last breath left his body. The final act of this trilogy of terror took place in Cordon's room. For his 5-year-old son, Alan used nothing but his hands. The boy was too small to offer any real resistance. His death was swift. After extinguishing the lives of his 3 children, Alan walked out, but not before leaving a note, a chilling piece of psychological transference that read, "You have made me a killer." The accusation was aimed squarely at Darcy. In his warped perception of events, the blame was entirely hers. If she had only stayed, if she hadn't betrayed him, their children would still be alive. He then retreated into the wilderness near Merritt, a fugitive hiding in the dense woods for days. The next day, April 6, 2008, Darcy returned home from her shift to a scene of unimaginable horror. She found the bodies of Caitlin, Max, and Cordon. Her call to 911 brought police, who could only confirm the tragic reality. A massive manhunt swept the region. Helicopters sliced through the air, search dogs tracked scents on the ground, and dozens of officers combed the forest surrounding Merritt. On April 9, 2008, the search ended. Alan was discovered in a shed, roughly 18 kilometers from the crime scene. His capture was quiet. He offered no resistance. The charges were as severe as they come. 3 counts of first-degree murder. His trial convened in 2010 at the BC Supreme Court in Kamloops, but this would not be a typical murder trial. Schomborn's defense constructed an argument centered not on his innocence, but on his sanity. They contended he was not criminally responsible, a victim of his own mind, presenting evidence that he was gripped by profound delusions and psychosis when he killed his children. Psychiatric experts took the stand, testifying that Alan's reality was a paranoid fantasy. He believed, they claimed, that he was saving his children from certain sexual abuse by ending their lives, a heroic act in his mind, meant to thwart a conspiracy he believed Darcy and others were a part of. On September 1, 2010, the jury delivered its verdict. Alan Schomborn was found not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder. This legal distinction meant he would never see the inside of a prison cell. Instead, his sentence was to be served in a forensic psychiatric hospital. He was committed to the Colony Farm Forensic Psychiatric Hospital in Coquitlam, British Columbia. Over the years, the man who had methodically killed his 3 children began to reclaim his freedom, piece by piece. By 2015, he was being granted escorted day passes into the community. 2 years later, in 2017, the escorts were gone. Then, in 2020, against the fervent objections of Darcy Clark in the community, Alan was granted conditional leave to live in a supportive housing facility. There were conditions, of course: no contact with Darcy or her family, no weapons, and a strict medication regimen. But the fact remained, he was living in the community. For Darcy Clark, every step he took toward freedom was a step she fought to prevent. She became a fixture at every review board hearing, her voice raw as she delivered victim impact statements, painting a picture of the devastation he had wrought. Her position was unwavering. Alan Schomborn should never be allowed to leave the confines of the hospital. To her, his presence in the community while her children lay in their graves was an unbearable miscarriage of justice. She continues to channel her grief into advocacy, fighting to reform the very laws that designated him not criminally responsible. Caitlin had been 10 years old. Max was 8. Cordon, just 5. Their father stole their lives because their mother had dared to leave him. He cast himself as the victim, forced into the role of a killer, a delusion he scrawled in a final note before vanishing into the woods as the police closed in. He was captured. He faced a court, but he was deemed a patient, not a criminal, and served no prison time. Today, he lives in a community, under supervision. Before we move on to the next case, Make sure to subscribe if you find these stories as deeply disturbing as I do. It helps us continue examining the cases that most channels are unwilling to touch. The case of Alan Schoenborn, a man who smothered and strangled his own 3 children, yet sidestepped a prison cell through a defense of a disordered mind. And in Ontario, another father would use his car, spinning a narrative that his daughter needed rescuing from an abusive mother. Case 15. Robin Brown. On February 9, 2020, in Milton, Ontario, Robin Brown drowned his 8-year-old daughter, Kira Kagan, in the bathtub of his home. Kira had been with her father for a standard weekend visit. It was meant to be a normal, court-ordered custody exchange. Instead, Robin filled a tub with water, forced Kira beneath the surface until she stopped breathing, and then dialed 911 to report that he had killed his daughter. Robin Brown was 57 years old. For years, he had been locked in a bitter custody war with Kira's mother, Jennifer Kagan. The relationship between Robin and Jennifer had been toxic from its inception. They never married. Kira was born in 2011. By the time she was a toddler, the two were already enmeshed in legal battles over custody. Robin maintained that Jennifer was an unfit parent. He leveled accusations of abuse and neglect, repeatedly petitioning the court in an attempt to secure sole custody of their daughter. The family court system consistently disagreed with his claims. Despite his relentless allegations, no evidence ever substantiated that Jennifer was abusing or neglecting Kira. The courts awarded primary custody to Jennifer, granting Robin a schedule of supervised visitations. Robin's fury was a corrosive thing. In his mind, the system had betrayed him. The courts irrevocably slanted towards mothers. A relentless stream of motions and complaints flowed from him, each one carrying the same dark allegation, that his daughter, Kira, was in danger in her mother's home. The weekend of February 8th to 9th, 2020, began like any other scheduled visit. Kira was with her father, Robin, but on Sunday, February 9th, a dark resolve crystallized in Robin's mind. If he couldn't have Kira, no one would. He drew a bath. He led his 8-year-old daughter, Kira, into the bathroom. And then, he held her beneath the surface of the water, waiting until the struggle ceased. She fought, a small child against the unyielding weight of a grown man. It was a battle she could not win. Kira drowned. In the silence that followed, Robin picked up the phone and dialed 911. His voice, when he spoke to the dispatcher, was eerily calm as he confessed to drowning his own daughter. His justification was a warped narrative of protection. He claimed he was saving her from her mother, that the alleged abuse left him with no alternative. The dispatcher, trained for these moments, kept Robin on the line, a fragile connection to a scene of unimaginable horror as police and paramedics raced towards the address. First responders arrived to a scene of profound stillness. They found Kira's small body in the tub. A pronouncement of death was made. Robin was taken into custody without incident. The charge was first-degree murder, but in the interrogation room, detectives were met not with grief or regret, but with a chilling absence of remorse. He insisted he had done the right thing. He had saved her, he maintained, from a lifetime of suffering. The blame, in his distorted logic, lay squarely with Jennifer. Her refusal to grant him full custody, he argued, had sealed Kira's fate. If only the courts had listened, he claimed, his daughter would still be alive. But investigators combing through his claims found nothing, absolutely no evidence of abuse. It wasn't the first time his allegations had been scrutinized. Over the years, Child Protective Services had launched multiple inquiries based on his reports, and every single time, the conclusion was the same. No credible evidence that Kira was ever in harm's way. The portrait painted by teachers, doctors, and friends was of a different reality, one where Kira was a bright, happy, and deeply loved child. The allegations, it became clear, were the product of a singular, paranoid obsession, rooted in his inability to accept the loss of custody. In 2021, at the Superior Court of Justice in Milton, the trial began. The prosecution laid out a case not of sudden rage, but of cold premeditation. Robin, they argued, had planned this. In the weeks leading up to the murder, he had dropped chilling hints to those around him, speaking of lost hope and the potential need for drastic action. The act of filling the bathtub was not incidental. It was the chosen instrument for his daughter's murder. This wasn't a crime of passion, the prosecution contended, but a calculated execution. The defense, in turn, built their case around Robin's mental state, arguing he was in the grips of a profound disorder. They presented psychiatric testimony asserting that Robin's beliefs about Jennifer were not just suspicions, but clinical delusions. The prosecution countered this, painting a picture of a man who, outside this one dark fixation, was entirely functional. He held a job, he managed his own finances. His court filings were articulate, his legal arguments coherent. His delusions were a laser-focused pathology, confined only to the custody battle. It was not enough, the Crown argued, to absolve him of criminal responsibility. On September 17, 2021, the jury delivered its verdict. Robin Brown was guilty of second-degree murder. The sentence: life in prison with no chance of parole for 16 years. The judge, at sentencing, cut to the heart of the matter, calling it an act of pure selfishness. He dismantled Robin's claim of love, stating that love does not manifest itself by drowning an 8-year-old child in a tub. The ripple effect of his actions, the judge noted, had destroyed countless lives, not least of all, his own. At the sentencing, Jennifer Kagan stood to give her victim impact statement. She spoke of the unbearable void left by Kira's absence, and the gut-wrenching memory of her daughter's excitement about visiting her dad that weekend. She recounted their final embrace, the last time she would ever tell Kira that she loved her. She forced the court to hear the details of that phone call from police, the moment her world shattered. The moment she learned not only that her daughter was gone, but that Robin had been the one to take her. She declared she could never forgive Robin, that he had destroyed the most precious thing in her life. Throughout Jennifer's statement, Robin remained a statue of indifference. His gaze was fixed, vacant. When offered the opportunity to speak, he said nothing. He was escorted from the courtroom and transported to prison. Kira Kagan was 8 years old. Her father had drowned her in a bathtub. His motive, a chilling refusal to accept that her mother had won primary custody. He dialed 911, inventing a story that he had killed his daughter to shield her from an abuse that existed only in his mind. He offered no remorse. He cast blame on everyone but himself. Robin Brown murdered his own daughter as an act of punishment against her mother, and as a grotesque protest against the family court system. Kira paid the ultimate price for her father's delusions. And as Robin Brown was confessing to drowning his daughter in a bathtub over a 911 call, another father, in Maryland, was methodically executing his 4 sleeping children before setting their house ablaze to conceal the crime. Case 16. Darren Boswell Johnson. On the morning of April 22, 2016, a call dispatched firefighters to a house fire at 1616 Swan Point Way in Fort Washington, Maryland. After they battled back the flames and breached the interior, they discovered 4 bodies. The first was Miracle Johnson, age 14. Devin Johnson was 9. Zoe Johnson was 5. Cameron Johnson was 9 months old. The investigation would later reveal that all 4 children had been shot in the head before the fire was ever started. The 5th body belonged to their father, Darren Boswell Johnson, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Darren Boswell Johnson was 45 years old and worked as a long-haul truck driver. He and the children's mother, Chantel Johnson, had been together for over a decade. They were never married, but they had 4 children. Miracle was from Chantel's previous relationship, but Darren had helped raise the girl since she was a toddler. Devin, Zoe, and Cameron were Darren's biological children. But over the last year, the relationship between Darren and Chantel had been steadily deteriorating. Chantel had entered into a new relationship with another man. She had informed Darren their time together was over. Darren's reaction was not one of sadness, but of pure rage. He could not process the idea that Chantel would choose someone else. He could not accept that his family was fracturing. In the weeks that preceded the murders, Darren's behavior became increasingly unstable. He began making threats. He voiced a terrifying sentiment, that he would rather see the children dead than allow them to be raised by another man. On the night of April 21, 2016, Chantel was not in the home. She was staying elsewhere, which left Darren alone with Miracle, Devin, Zoe, and Cameron. At some point in the suffocating darkness of that night, Darren moved silently through the house, entering each of his children's bedrooms as they slept. He shot Miracle in the head. She was 14 years old. She died in her own bed. He shot Devin in the head. He was 9 years old. He died in his own bed. He shot Zoe in the head. She was 5 years old. She died in her own bed. He shot Cameron in the head. Cameron was a 9-month-old baby. He died in his crib. After executing all 4 children, Darren began the work of erasing his crime. He moved through the house, pouring accelerant in multiple rooms. He needed to destroy the evidence. He needed this to look like a tragic accident, as if the children had perished in the fire. Then, Darren put the gun to his own head. He died in the growing inferno, surrounded by the 4 children he had just murdered. Firefighters arrived on the scene at approximately 7 in the morning on April 22nd. Neighbors had called 911 after seeing smoke and flames pouring from the residence. The crews battled the blaze, eventually bringing the fire under control. Once they could enter the structure, they found the 5 bodies. The medical examiner's findings were stark. All 4 children had died from gunshot wounds to the head, not the fire. The examiner also ruled that Darren had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The Prince George's County Police began their investigation of the scene. They recovered a handgun near Darren's body. They located shell casings in the bedroom of each child. They confirmed the presence of accelerant throughout the home. The investigation concluded that Darren had murdered his children, set the fire, and then committed suicide. There was no evidence to suggest anyone else was involved. The police then had the grim task of notifying Chantel Johnson. The news destroyed her. She had been actively trying to leave the relationship, to get herself and her children away from Darren's increasing violence. She had harbored a growing fear that Darren might hurt her, but she had never once conceived that he was capable of murdering all 4 of their children. She told police about the threats Darren had been making. She recounted how he'd warned her that if she left him, she would live to regret it. She remembered his chilling words, that the children would be better off dead than raised by another man. But because Darren killed himself, there would be no trial. There would be no courtroom where Chantel could confront the man who had stolen her world. There would be no jury to hold him accountable, no judge to hand down a sentence. Darren had ripped that possibility away when he shot himself. He had murdered 4 children and, in his final act, escaped all earthly consequences for his actions. The Prince George's County community held vigils, mourning for Miracle, Devin, Zoe, and Cameron. The community reeled. Hundreds gathered to mourn the children and offer support to their mother, Chantel. A memorial fund was set up for funeral costs. The children were laid to rest together. Chantel is a regular visitor to their graves. Miracle, just 14 years old. Devin, 9. Zoe, 5. And Cameron, only 9 months old. Their own father had executed each one with a gunshot to the head as they slept, before engulfing the house in flames to conceal his crime. His final act was to turn the gun on himself, a last resort to evade the consequences of his actions. Darren Boswell Johnson murdered his 4 children because their mother had moved on. He had executed them, one by one, in their sleep. He torched the home, then ended his own life. The final tally? 4 dead children, all because one man could not accept the end of a relationship. The capacity for such acts is difficult to comprehend. If you feel compelled to understand the darker aspects of human nature, consider subscribing as we continue to explore these cases. Your support allows us to shed light on the stories that often remain in the shadows. The case of Darren Boswell Johnson, a father who systematically executed his children before setting their home ablaze, is a study in possessive rage. But our next case, out of California, involves a different kind of public horror. A father who threw his own toddler from a cliff in broad daylight before leaping to his own death. This is case 17. Stephen Garcia. The date was Sunday, July 11th, 2010. The location, a scenic outlook known as Inspiration Point, high in the San Bernardino Mountains of California. Stephen Garcia took his 4-year-old son, Wyatt, to the edge of a cliff and hurled him into the abyss. The boy's body fell 120 feet down the mountainside, ultimately coming to rest on a bed of jagged rocks. The impact killed him instantly. Stephen then plunged from the same precipice, but the fall didn't claim his life. It only left him with catastrophic injuries. Tourists at the scenic overlook were helpless witnesses, watching the horror unfold in the clear light of day. The father was 38-year-old Stephen Garcia, a resident of Corona, California. He made his living in construction. He and Wyatt's mother, Ann Campbell, had been involved in a long-term relationship, but had never married. Wyatt was born in 2006. By the time he was a toddler, his parents, Stephen and Ann, had already gone their separate ways. A custody agreement was in place, one that granted Stephen consistent, scheduled time with his son. On the surface, there was nothing to suggest a problem. Stephen appeared to be a devoted father, a man who loved his son, but privately, The connection between him and Anne had decayed into something poisonous. Stephen could not process the fact that Anne was moving on with her life. The reality that she was dating other men was something he couldn't accept. His jealousy festered, manifesting as a need for control. The threats began. He warned Anne that if she did not return to him, he would make her regret it. Anne took some of these threats seriously enough to report them to the police, yet no formal charges were ever filed. The scheduled visits between Stephen and Wyatt continued without interruption. On the weekend of July 10th and 11th, 2010, Wyatt was with his father. It was meant to be nothing more than a standard father-son weekend. But that Sunday morning, Stephen drove Wyatt deep into the San Bernardino Mountains. He told others the plan was simply to go for a hike. Their destination was Inspiration Point, a popular overlook known for its breathtaking vistas of the valley below. It was a place frequented by families, equipped with guardrails and cautionary signs, a location designed for peace and beauty. Stephen parked his vehicle and walked with Wyatt toward the overlook. Several other people were there, taking in the scenery on a clear, sunlit morning. He then lifted Wyatt into his arms. To the casual observer, it looked like a father helping his young son get a better view. But then Stephen moved directly to the edge. He hoisted Wyatt up and over the guardrail, casting him into the open air. The boy plummeted 120 feet down the rocky face of the mountain. He was only 4 years old. The fall was not survivable. Screams erupted from the witnesses. Some instinctively rushed toward Stephen, but it was too late. He immediately scaled the guardrail and followed his son over the edge. He fell the same 120 feet, but Stephen's body impacted the ground differently than Wyatt's. He lived. He was found with multiple broken bones, severe internal trauma, and a significant head injury. But he was alive. The first calls to emergency services were immediate. Helicopters were scrambled, and rescue teams began to rappel down the treacherous cliff face. They located Wyatt's body among the rocks. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Nearby, they found Stephen, grievously wounded but still conscious. A medevac helicopter airlifted him to Loma Linda University Medical Center. Doctors performed multiple life-saving surgeries, and as Stephen began his recovery, investigators began interviewing the witnesses. Every single person at Inspiration Point that morning told the same chilling story. Stephen Garcia had intentionally, deliberately thrown his son from the cliff. There was no accident. It wasn't a tragic misstep. It was the calculated murder of a child by his own father, performed in front of an audience. Stephen was formally arrested in his hospital bed, charged with first-degree murder. His trial convened in 2011 at the San Bernardino County Superior Court. The prosecution's case was built on the testimony of every witness who was at Inspiration Point that terrible day. One by one, they took the stand and described seeing Stephen lift his son, approach the barrier, and throw him over. They recounted the sound of Wyatt's scream during the fall. They spoke of the absolute horror of witnessing a father murder his own child in the middle of the day. The evidence against him was crushing. Stephen's defense team attempted to build a case around a severe mental breakdown. They called psychiatric experts to testify that Stephen had been suffering from a deep depression. The narrative they presented was that he had been suicidal and, in a twisted act of love, decided to take Wyatt with him so the boy wouldn't have to grow up without a father. But the prosecution argued that Stephen's actions were anything but spontaneous. He had planned to drive into the mountains. He had parked the car. He had walked to that specific overlook. He had lifted Wyatt into his arms and then cast him from the edge of the cliff. These were the calculated motions of a man fully aware of his actions, not the fumbling of someone lost to reason. On December 1st, 2011, a jury returned its verdict, finding Stephen Garcia guilty of murder in the first degree. The jury also affirmed the special circumstance allegation. The murder was intentional and had involved the infliction of torture. The grounds for the torture finding rested on the understanding that Wyatt was conscious during his descent, fully experiencing the terror of the fall before his life ended. This special circumstance meant that Stephen now faced the possibility of capital punishment. In the trial's penalty phase, jurors were confronted with the human cost of the crime through impact statements from Anne Campbell and other relatives. Anne painted a portrait of Wyatt as a joyful, affectionate child, one who held an unshakable trust in his father. She recounted the moment law enforcement delivered the news that Stephen had thrown Wyatt from a cliff and spoke of the crushing, unbearable weight of losing her son in such a monstrous way. She articulated to the jury the motive behind the murder. Stephen had executed their son to punish her for daring to leave him. Wyatt's death was an act of pure vengeance. On January 13, 2012, the jury returned with its final decision, sentencing Stephen Garcia to death, a sentence the judge later affirmed. Stephen was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where he was to await his execution on death row, and where he remains to this day. The state of California has not carried out an execution since 2006, entangled in persistent legal challenges over its lethal injection protocol. Stephen Garcia will almost certainly live out his days inside a prison cell, never to face the executioner. Wyatt Garcia was 4 years old. His own father hurled him from a 120-foot cliff in full view of witnesses at a picturesque overlook on a bright Sunday morning. Wyatt's screams followed him down. He died upon impact with the rocks below. His father leaped after him, but he survived. Stephen had murdered his son to inflict the ultimate pain on the boy's mother for leaving him. He orchestrated Wyatt's death to be as public and as traumatic as one could possibly engineer. Then, he attempted to take his own life, a final act to sidestep the consequences of his deeds. He failed. He survived. And now, he sits on death row. While Stephen Garcia committed his crime out in the open, before the eyes of strangers, our next case unfolds in the suffocating privacy of a family home, where a father in Texas drowned his 2 small children in a bathtub as their mother listened, helpless, on the phone. This is the case of Mohammed Gohar. On the evening of September 14, 2010, in Houston, Texas, Mohammed Gohar submerged his 2 children in a bathtub until they drowned. Akbar was 3 years old. Aliyah was 1. Mohammed held each of them beneath the surface of the water, waiting until their struggles ceased. As he took their lives, he kept their mother, Rayella, on the phone line. She was forced to hear her children's screams, forced to hear the sound of the splashing water. She pleaded with Mohammed to stop, but he would not. Instead, he commanded her to listen while he murdered their children. Mohammed Gohar was a 26-year-old immigrant, originally from Pakistan. He had come to the United States and entered into an arranged marriage with Rayella. The couple had 2 children. Akbar was born in 2007, and Aliyah followed in 2009. The family resided in Houston, where Mohammed earned a living in the construction trade. To the outside world, they presented the image of a typical immigrant family carving out a new life in America. But behind closed doors, Rayella's existence was one of silent suffering. Mohammed was a controlling, abusive man. He policed her every action. He forbade her from working. He prevented her from having friends. He denied her contact with her own family in Pakistan unless he first gave his consent. On the occasions Rayella dared to defy him, he would beat her. The violence intensified after Aliyah was born, and Rayella started to formulate a plan of escape. In September of 2010, Rayella finally left Mohammed, taking Akbar and Aliyah with her. She found refuge with relatives and immediately filed for divorce. She was granted a protective order against Mohammed, and the court awarded her temporary custody, allowing Mohammed only supervised visits with the children. The turn of events sent Mohammed into a rage. He was consumed by the humiliation of his wife leaving him. Within his cultural framework, the husband held absolute authority. That Rayella had defied that authority and taken his children was a profound insult he could not endure. Mohammed began to harass Rayella incessantly with phone calls and a barrage of text messages. He started appearing at places he anticipated she would be, violating the protective order without a second thought. He warned Rayella that she would regret her decision if she did not return to him, insisting the children were his property and that she possessed no right to them. Rayella reported these violations to the police, but her complaints led to no action. On September 14, 2010, Mohammed manipulated Rayella into letting him see Akbar and Aliyah, telling her he just wanted a few hours with them. He swore he would bring them back. Despite her reservations, Rayella relented, clinging to the hope that her children could still have a connection with their father. She placed Akbar and Aliyah into Mohammed's care. He then drove them to the house where the family had once lived together. Once inside the house with the children, Mohammed placed a call to Rayella. He informed her that she was never going to see Akbar and Aliyah again. Rayella pleaded with him to bring them back, threatening to call the authorities. Mohammed just laughed. He dared her to call the police, telling her it was pointless. By the time they could arrive, he said, the children would already be dead. Through the phone, Rayella could hear the faint sounds of Akbar and Aliyah crying in the background. The sound came through the phone, first water running, filling a bathtub. She screamed into the receiver, a raw plea for Muhammad to stop. He had put the phone on speaker. He wanted her to be a witness. She was forced to listen as he took their 3-year-old son, Akbar, into the bathroom. Then came the sound of splashing. She heard her son screaming. She heard Muhammad's cold voice telling him to be quiet. And then the screaming stopped. Muhammad's voice came back on the line, flat and empty, to inform Rayella that Akbar was dead. Her world collapsed into hysterical sobs and screams. She begged him to spare Aliyah, their 1-year-old daughter. He ignored her pleas. He took the baby into the bathroom, and the splashing sound began again. This time, she heard Aliyah crying. The little girl was too young to fight, too young to even scream for help. She was just a baby. And then, her crying also stopped. Muhammad told Rayella that Aliyah was gone, too. But he didn't hang up. He stayed on the line, forcing her to absorb the silence he had created. He told her she was the one who had caused all of this. He explained that if she had simply stayed, if she had been a good wife, their children would still be alive. In his twisted narrative, her leaving him was the act that had killed them. Then he disconnected the call. Rayella immediately dialed 911. She told the dispatcher the unthinkable, that her husband had just drowned their 2 children. She relayed the address of the house. When police arrived on the scene, they found Muhammad still inside the home, with the bodies of Akbar and Aliyah. Both children were in the bathtub. They were gone. Muhammad was discovered sitting calmly in the living room. He made no attempt to run, no effort to hide. His arrest was without incident. The state charged him with 2 counts of capital murder. In Texas, a capital murder conviction leads to one of 2 sentences: the death penalty or life in prison without any possibility of parole. Muhammad's trial began in 2012 at the Harris County Criminal Court in Houston. The prosecution presented a timeline of evidence that showed these were planned executions. He had deliberately tricked Rayella into giving him access to the children. He had called her for the specific purpose of making her listen to them die. He had taunted her through the phone as he took their lives. This was a premeditated, calculated act of murder, meticulously designed to inflict the maximum possible suffering on Rayella. The defense floated a theory that Muhammad was suffering from cultural stress and the adjustment issues of being an immigrant. They claimed the pressures of American life had become overwhelming, causing him to snap. The prosecution systematically dismissed this argument. Evidence showed Muhammad was functioning perfectly in all other aspects of his life. He was employed, he was handling his finances, he had been articulating clear, coherent threats to Rayella for some time. He was in complete control of his actions when he drowned Akbar and Aliyah. On April 19, 2012, the jury found Muhammad Gohar guilty of 2 counts of capital murder. During the sentencing phase, the jury listened to victim impact statements from Rayella and other members of her family. Rayella recounted the horror of hearing her children die over the phone. She described their screams and the profound, terrifying silence that followed. She spoke of the torment of living every day, knowing her children were crying out for her as they drowned, and she was powerless to save them. She told the court that Muhammad had not only taken her children, he had utterly destroyed her life, and that the damage he had done was irreparable. On April 25, 2012, the jury returned with a sentence for Muhammad Gohar, death. The judge affirmed their decision. Muhammad was transferred to death row at the Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas. He remains there today, awaiting his execution. Texas actively carries out its death sentences. Unlike in other states, Muhammad Gohar's sentence is not a question of if, but when he will be executed by lethal injection. Akbar was 3 years old. Aliyah was 1. Their father drowned them in a bathtub and forced their mother to listen. He then told her it was her fault for daring to leave him. He sat calmly in the living room with their bodies and waited for the police. He has never shown any remorse. He is on death row. Before we proceed to the next case file, please subscribe if you believe these stories, no matter how disturbing, need to be told. Your support helps us continue to cover the cases that most other outlets shy away from. The case of Muhammad Gohar is a study in calculated cruelty, but our next file, from South Africa, details a father who threw his 4 children from a bridge, one by one, before jumping himself and surviving to stand trial. Case 19, Sibiso Mungos. It was the morning of September 22, 2019, on the Ulas Road Bridge near Pinetown, South Africa. There, a man named Kibiso Mapos threw his 4 children from the bridge, one after another. Quasi was 9 years old, Shaniqua was 8, Schneidlanter was 6, and Ayanda was only 4. Each child plunged approximately 40 meters, or 131 feet, into the river gorge below. All 4 of them perished. Sibiso then threw himself from the same bridge. He survived the fall, but with severe injuries. Sibiso was a 40-year-old taxi driver from Isangani in the KwaZulu-Natal province. He had been in a relationship with the children's mother, Zisilele Majoka, though they had never married. Together, they had 4 children. The relationship between Sibiso and Zisilele had been troubled for years, marked by his controlling and possessive behavior. He could not accept that Zisilele wanted to end their relationship. In 2019, she finally left Kibiso and began a new life with another man. Sibiso was incandescent with rage. He issued threats repeatedly. He told Kole that if she didn't come back, he would remove the children from her life for good. He let it be known throughout their community that Kole would come to deeply regret her decision to leave. He confided in his own family, telling them he was orchestrating something that would guarantee her suffering for the remainder of her life. On the morning of September 22, 2019, Kibiso arrived to pick up Quasi, Shaniqua, Snenchlanchula, and Ayand from their mother's home. He told Halil the benign story that he was taking them for a visit with his family. Halil consented. She had no conceivable reason to suspect that Kibiso was, in fact, planning to murder them. She kissed each of her children goodbye as they climbed into his taxi. Sibiso drove the children to the Umlas Road Bridge, near Pinetown. It is a structure that spans a deep gorge carved by the Malas River. During the day, it's a heavily trafficked road with a constant flow of cars. Kibiso pulled his taxi over to the side of the bridge. He got out. He opened the rear passenger door. He reached in for 9-year-old Quasi and carried her toward the bridge's edge. Drivers and passing vehicles saw what was about to happen. Horns blared. People shouted. But Sibiso ignored them and threw Quasi over the railing. She fell 40 meters into the gorge below. Death was instantaneous. Kibiso then walked calmly back to the taxi. He grabbed 8-year-old Shaniqua. By this time, traffic had stopped as stunned drivers watched the scene unfold. Some were already on the phone with the police. Others rushed towards Sibiso, trying to intervene, but he lifted Shaniqua and threw her over the railing. She fell 40 meters, killed instantly on impact. Sibiso walked back to the taxi. He took 6-year-old Snen Landler. Horrified screams erupted from the onlookers, pleading with him to stop. A few tried to physically block his path, but Kibiso moved too quickly. He hurled Stenfland over the same railing after a 40-meter fall. She died on impact. Sibiso returned to the vehicle one last time for 4-year-old Ayanda. A crowd of helpless spectators had now formed. People clawed at Sibiso, desperate to pull the little girl away from him, but he sprinted to the railing and threw Ayanda over the edge. She plunged 40 meters. Her death was instantaneous. After sending all 4 of his children to their deaths, Kibiso climbed the railing himself and jumped. He fell the same 40 meters into the gorge below, but unlike his children, Kibiso did not die. The way he landed spared him from an immediate death. His body was shattered, broken bones, severe internal bleeding, and significant head trauma, but he was alive. Emergency crews arrived on the scene within minutes. They rappelled down into the ravine where they discovered the bodies of Quasi, Shaniqua, Snandla, and Ayanda. All 4 children were deceased. They found Sibiso not far away, critically injured but still conscious. He was airlifted to a hospital. He would endure multiple surgeries and he would survive. While Sibiso was recovering, police began interviewing the eyewitnesses. Over a dozen people had been forced to watch as Kibiso systematically threw his children from the bridge, one by one. The evidence against him was irrefutable. Sibiso was placed under arrest in his hospital bed, charged with 4 counts of murder. The trial of Kibiso began in 2020 at the Pietermaritzburg High Court. The prosecution built its case on the testimony of those who saw the killings firsthand. They described the horror of watching Sibiso throw each child from the bridge as a chorus of screams and pleas tried to stop him. They spoke of the absolute terror of witnessing 4 small children fall to their deaths. The prosecution submitted evidence showing that the murders were a calculated act. He had told others that he intended to make Solikal suffer. He had gathered all 4 children at the same time. He had taken them to a precise location where he knew their lives would end. This was a premeditated act of mass murder. Sibiso's defense counsel attempted to argue that he was in the throes of a profound depression and had suffered a complete mental collapse. They offered psychiatric testimony that Chibeso had been emotionally shattered by the end of his relationship with Kyle, but the prosecution systematically countered that Chibeso's actions demonstrated a chilling level of intent. He drove to that bridge. He stopped the car. He methodically threw each child to their death, one by one, ignoring every attempt to stop him. These were the deliberate, calculated maneuvers of a killer. On September 9, 2020, Judge Esther Stein found Chibeso Pangos guilty on all 4 counts of murder. During the sentencing phase, Judge Stein called it one of the most heinous acts she had ever presided over. She stated that he had used his own children as weapons of revenge against their mother. In her view, there were no mitigating factors whatsoever that could possibly lessen the severity of his sentence. On September 10, 2020, Judge Stein sentenced Chibeso Pangos to 4 life sentences, 1 for each child he had murdered. The sentences were set to run concurrently, meaning Chibeso would serve 1 single life term. He was incarcerated at Westville Prison in Durban. He will never be eligible for parole. Solisi Lame Joker delivered a victim impact statement at the trial. She recounted the moment that the police informed her that Chibeso had thrown their children from a bridge. She spoke of the unbearable task of identifying the remains of Kwasi, Shaniqua, Snenflant, and Ayanda. She articulated the profound, unending pain of losing all 4 of her children in the space of a single morning. She told the court that Chibeso had annihilated her world. She declared she would never grant him forgiveness, her only hope that he would suffer in prison for the remainder of his days. Kwasi was only 9 years old. Shaniqua was 8, was 6, and Ayandanda was 4. In the stark light of day, their father hurled them from a bridge, one by one, as witnesses watched in horror. Each child plunged 40 meters to their death. After his children were gone, their father jumped, but he survived the fall. He is now serving 4 life sentences for the day Chibeso Mopong threw his children from a bridge in 2019. The final case we examined takes place nearly 2 decades earlier, also in South Africa, where another father would weaponize fire to murder his 5 children and obliterate all traces of what he had done. Case 20. Yanni Bucas. On March 18, 2000, in the city of Rustenburg, South Africa, Yanni Bucas incinerated his 5 children. Ansel was 8 years old, Johan was 7, Jacko was 5, JP was 3, and Michelle was only 18 months old. Janny trapped them inside the family car, doused the vehicle with petrol, and set it ablaze. All 5 were burned alive. Janny then attempted his own exit by ingesting rat poison, but he survived. Janny Bucas was 30 years old and a police officer in Rustenburg. He and the children's mother, Rihanna Bucas, had been married since 1991. They brought 5 children into the world together. And to the outside community, Yanni projected the image of a dedicated father and husband. He was a man with a badge, a man who sat in a church pew, a man who coached his children's sports teams. The family occupied a home in a middle-class Rustenburg neighborhood. No one could have suspected that, behind the facade of their home, Janny was an abusive and controlling tyrant. For years, Rihanna had been subjected to his relentless emotional and psychological warfare. He seized control of her finances. He dictated who she was allowed to see and where she was allowed to go. He relentlessly told her that without him, she was worthless. But in early 2000, Rihanna decided she could endure no more. She informed Janny that she wanted a divorce and that she was taking the children with her when she left. For a man obsessed with control, this was an intolerable outcome. He warned Rihanna that if she left, she would lose everything. He promised her it was a choice she would regret for the rest of her life. On the weekend of March 18, 2000, Rihanna left the house to run errands. She left Ansel, Johan, Jacob, JP, and Michelle in Janny's custody. It was supposed to be just another Saturday. Rihanna expected to be home within a few hours. But during her absence, Janny resolved that if Rihanna intended to take the children from him, then no one would have them. Janny rounded up his 5 children, telling them they were going for a ride. He led them out to the family car and told them to get inside. Ansel, Johan, Jacko, and JP climbed into the back seat. Janny methodically secured 18-month-old Michelle into her car seat. The children believed they were simply going for a drive. They were oblivious to the horror their father was about to unleash. Once all 5 children were situated, Johnny sealed the doors and locked them. There was no way out. He walked to the garage and returned with a container of petrol. He came back to the car and began to saturate the vehicle with fuel. Inside, a dawning terror began to take hold. They began beating their small hands against the windows, their screams pleading with their father to release them. But Janny was deaf to their cries. Janny struck a match and tossed it onto the gasoline-soaked car. The vehicle instantly became an inferno. The children's screams were swallowed by the flames. They fought to break the windows, to unlock the doors, but the fire spread with inhuman speed. The crushing heat overwhelmed him. Ansel was 8 years old, Johann was 7, Jacko was 5, JP was 3, Michelle was 18 months old. All 5 children burned to death inside that car as their own father stood and watched. Only after his children were dead did Johnny go back into the house and drink rat poison. He planned to kill himself, to die with them, but the poison failed to kill him. He became violently ill, but he lived. Neighbors, drawn by the pillar of smoke, had already called the fire department. When firefighters arrived and extinguished the blaze, they discovered the charred remains of 5 children inside the car. Inside the house, they found Janny, sick from the poison, but alive. Janny was rushed to a hospital for treatment. The moment he was deemed medically stable, he was arrested and charged with 5 counts of murder. Investigators found no evidence that any other person had been involved in the crime. The investigation concluded that Yanni had deliberately murdered his children to inflict the ultimate punishment on Rihanna for leaving him. The police had to notify Rihanna Boers of her children's deaths. She had been out for just a few hours. She was returning home, expecting to see her kids. Instead, she was met by a wall of fire trucks and police cars, and the burned-out shell of a vehicle that now served as a tomb for her 5 children. The trauma was beyond imagination. She had left them with their father for a mere few hours. She had returned to find every one of them dead. Janey's trial convened in 2001 at the Northwest High Court in Rustenburg. The prosecution laid out the evidence, painting a picture of murders that were meticulously planned. He had collected all 5 children. He had locked them inside the car. He had poured the petrol, and he had set it on fire. These were meticulously planned actions, designed with the sole purpose of causing death. The prosecution's core argument was that Yanni murdered his children to inflict the ultimate punishment on Rihanna for seeking a divorce. Yanni's defense team attempted to portray him as a man suffering from a crippling depression, arguing he was not in a rational state of mind. They presented psychiatric assessments suggesting Yanni had been broken by Rihanna's decision to leave, but the state countered that his actions showed clear forethought and intent. He had selected a method that would leave no room for survival. He had locked them inside the car to prevent any chance of escape. He had used enough gasoline to ensure the fire would be swift and fatal. This was calculated murder. On July 13, 2001, the court found Yanni Bucas guilty on 5 counts of murder. Judge Jan Klett handed down 5 life sentences, 1 for each child he killed, to be served concurrently. Janny was transferred to prison. He will never have the possibility of parole. Rihanna also provided a victim impact statement to the court. She described the soul-crushing agony of losing all 5 of her children in a single day. She remembered how Ansel had been so thrilled about starting grade 3. She recalled how Jan had just learned how to ride a bicycle, and how Jacko had an absolute passion for playing soccer. She recalled the smallest of milestones. JP, just discovering how to piece words into sentences. Michelle, taking her first unsteady steps across the floor. She articulated a future of infinite possibilities, every single one of them erased by a conscious decision their father made. She testified that Yanni had not merely hurt her, but had systematically dismantled her entire existence, leaving a void from which she could never truly escape. Ansel was 8 years old, Johann was 7, Jacko was 5, JP 3, and Michelle only 18 months. Their father sealed them inside the family car, doused it in gasoline, and ignited it. He stood and watched as the flames consumed them. His final act was to ingest rat poison, but death denied him. He now serves 5 life sentences. The motive was an act of ultimate revenge. Yanni Bucas murdered his 5 children to punish their mother for wanting to leave him, immolating them inside a car in their own driveway. He survived his own self-destruction and now occupies a prison cell, while Rihanna is left with the haunting reality that she left her children in their father's care for just a few hours, only to come home to their ashes. For more deep investigations into the psychology of fathers who kill as an act of spousal revenge, make sure to subscribe. We will see you in the next investigation. The first promise of parenthood is a sanctuary, an unspoken vow that a child's world will always be safe from the storm. But these harrowing chronicles reveal a chilling inversion of that bond, the moment love curdles into a weapon. We must face the uncomfortable truth that these tragedies were rarely spontaneous. They were often the calculated climaxes of long-simmering control and systemic silence. Children are the heartbeat of our future, not the ammunition for our grievances. To honor these lost lives, we must transform our collective horror into hyper-vigilance. We must learn to recognize the red flags, the escalating verbal abuse, the chilling threats veiled as anger, and the desperate pleas for help that our systems too often categorize as simple harassment. True parenting is not an exercise of ownership. It is a lifetime of stewardship. Let these stories serve as a haunting reminder that whenever a child's safety is gambled in an adult's war, humanity loses. We must build a society where a child's joy isn't a target, but a treasure we protect with an iron will. Love must be the ultimate shield, never a sword of vengeance.